Arya Stark stood at the edge of a quiet wood as the sun fell below the horizon, painting the sky in burnished hues of copper and rose. She waited in stillness, breathing in the crisp air of the late autumn evening. The smell of wet leaves clung to her nostrils, and the distant rush of a narrow brook teased her ears with a gentle hum. Overhead, half-shed branches clacked in the breeze like ancient bones. She had grown used to lonely places such as this, places where the hush of the world wrapped around her like a shroud, and where memories might whisper in her ear if she stood still long enough. On nights like this, she was haunted by her past and guided by something she could neither name nor see. A nameless presence she had begun to believe was older than men, older than steel, older, perhaps, than the Seven themselves. If she had once scorned prayer as a child, it was because the gods of her father's keep had felt distant and silent. But here, among the creaking boughs and the dancing shadows, she thought she felt them pulsing in her blood. It was in these moments that her kill list came to her unbidden, a litany of names she once recited as a talisman against despair. Even now, after all she had seen and done, the list still hovered at the edges of her consciousness, though some names had drifted away and others had been crossed out in blood. At times she felt a fierce pride in carrying such a burden, but more often she felt only emptiness, a hollowness that echoed with each name. She had never entirely understood why she clung to them, as though they were the only tether holding her to life. Yet something deeper, darker, and older seemed to thread through her recitations, binding her fate to a power she did not quite comprehend. On certain nights, she felt like the entire Riverlands was watching her, or perhaps the great river of time itself was bending toward her. She wondered if this was how the old gods whispered their approval or gave their guidance. Standing at the edge of the wood, she carefully picked her way between moss-laden trunks and set off along a narrow path that twined deeper into darkness. The caw of a lone raven startled her. Its silhouette cut a shape across the sky before it vanished between branches. She remembered the stories old Nan used to tell, stories of the greenseers and their ravens, of children of the forest who could speak to the stones and the trees. Perhaps they had been the ones to leave the weirwoods behind as silent watchers. Ghostly white trunks with blood-red leaves, ever listening, ever watching. Arya could not quite say how she knew, but she felt in her bones that something out here recognized her. As a younger girl, she might have dismissed it as the prickle of fear, but now she understood it to be a kind of presence, an ancient witness that tallied her deeds and her sins. She crept onward, stepping lightly as she had learned in Bravos, making almost no sound as her boots pressed upon fallen leaves. Ghosting across the forest floor, she sensed the hush of living trees, felt the hush of unseen creatures. She had learned that the quiet of a forest at dusk might contain more life than the busiest city street. Everything listened here, and everything saw. As if in confirmation, a branch rustled overhead. A small owl peered down with bright, unblinking eyes. Arya continued beneath its gaze, her heart calm but awake, the tension that had saved her life so many times thrumming just beneath her skin. An image of Nymeria flashed across her mind. The great direwolf had once been her closest companion, larger even than Arya's own fear, and as wild as the north from which they had come. In a sudden, wistful moment, she remembered that fateful day by the trident, the flash of jaws, the quick decision to drive her beloved wolf away to save her from the Lannisters' wrath. She had sometimes dreamed that Nymeria lingered in these woods, leading a pack of outcast wolves. In her more fanciful moments, she imagined that if she stepped in the right patch of moonlight, she might see the golden eyes shining at her from behind the undergrowth. And in some dreams, she even became the wolf, racing through the night, tasting the world through muzzle and fangs, feasting on the fear of men who had wronged her. Maybe it was not fancy at all, she thought with a tremor. Maybe it was a remnant of the old god's magic, twisting through her blood the way the northern air once twisted through her father's words. She had pushed on for another hour before she glimpsed a clearing lit by the pale glow of the moon. The clearing cradled a single weirwood tree, and its trunk glowed like bone in the darkness, its carved face seeming to weep tears of red sap. The hush became absolute as she stepped nearer. She swallowed, inhaling the scent of the forest's breath and the metallic tang of the weirwood's bleeding sap. Such trees existed mostly in the north, but occasionally she stumbled across them elsewhere. Each time, she felt the same prickling under her skin. It was as though the tree recognized her, though she was not sure how or why. She approached with slow, deliberate steps, her boots crushing the dried undergrowth in a steady rhythm. The red leaves shivered in a gust of wind that did not seem to touch the other trees. Was this truly the seat of the old god's power, or was that just a bedtime story? She stared at the carved face, searching it for secrets. The face stared back, its eyes pockets of shadow in the moonlight. For a moment, she wondered if they were truly empty. She leaned forward, half expecting it to whisper to her. She had heard tales of men who prayed to the old gods, men who cut their fingers and dripped blood upon the roots so the tree would remember their vow. Perhaps it was an old custom, a superstition, or maybe there was something in it older than reason. A chill skated down her spine, and her mind flickered to the names on her list. The sensation was immediate and gripping, as though the weirwood was calling them forth. She heard them in her mind as clearly as if her own lips were shaping the words. Circe, Gregor Clegane, Island Pain, and the others, names that had once been her lullaby. A swirl of anger and dread coiled in her stomach. She couldn't deny it anymore. Whenever she was near these trees, she felt a resonance, like a chord struck deep inside her. Something wanted those names as much as she did. The knowledge was unsettling. Yet, in a way, it was also comforting. It made her believe there was a purpose to all of it, that her vengeance was not just a petty mortal pursuit but part of a tapestry woven by older, greater hands. She pressed her palm to the smooth bark. The white wood was surprisingly warm, as though an unseen pulse beat beneath its surface. It felt alive, more alive than some humans she had known. The moment her skin touched the trunk, her breath hitched. Her eyes fluttered shut in the intensity of sensation. She felt the forest, the living roots that stretched for leagues, the night sky overhead with 1,000 silent stars, the half-moon gazing down at her like an unblinking eye. At the edges of her mind, she sensed faces. Faces she had worn, faces she had seen. They flickered and vanished like candle flames in the wind. And behind it all, there was a presence, a watchful awareness that seemed to say, "You are the instrument. Be sharpened." When she finally pulled away, she felt disoriented, as though she had been half-merged with the tree for hours. It was only a moment later that she realized her heart thundered in her chest. She remembered how she had felt glimpses of this connection in her wolf dreams. That sense of merging with Nymeria under the dark canopy, the desire to hunt and kill. A memory from years ago rose to the surface. She had once dreamt of the taste of blood in her mouth, the hot gush after tearing into the flesh of a man. She had woken trembling and wet with sweat, her heart pounding like war drums. Now she thought she understood that it had not been some random nightmare, but a fragment of the old god's primal domain. She was, in a sense, a vessel of something older than men's petty kingdoms. She tore her gaze from the weirwood and forced her legs to move. She found that she was trembling slightly, and her breath still came in short, sharp bursts. Though she had chosen this path, had trained her hands to serve the many-faced god, had learned to take faces and speak lies, she felt more a novice in this moment than she had in the house of black and white. She walked away, forging deeper into the darkness, her limbs carrying her on instinct. She did not look back at the weirwood's face, but she felt its invisible eyes upon her until the darkness of the wood swallowed the pale trunk. The forest around her was thick with the hush of nocturnal creatures. Tiny scurries through the underbrush told her that mice or voles were foraging. The sound of something larger, perhaps a fox, rustled the dead leaves in pursuit of prey. She realized how attuned she had become to these cues. She was no longer the sharp-tongued little girl from Winterfell, who had once chased cats with a wooden sword. She was something else now, forged in the fires of heartbreak and tempered by gods both new and old. Yet, in the tapestry of her life, the northern blood that ran through her veins had always been the loom on which her soul was woven. House Stark's words echoed in her mind. Winter is coming. She wondered if the old gods spoke in the same breath, if winter was their harbinger and she their hand. A half-smile tugged at her lips. She recalled the day she had left Westeros behind to train in Bravos. She had believed, in her childish hope, that crossing the narrow sea would peel away the memories of war and betrayal. Instead, she had found another form of war. A war of masks, illusions, and quiet assassinations. The many-faced god had taught her about death, about how to give it as a gift, how to stand as an impartial instrument of some universal balance. But she had never been impartial, not truly. That kill list had lingered, though she had tried to forget it. And somehow, she suspected the old gods, her father's gods, had never let her truly release it. Perhaps that was why she kept surviving the impossible. They had marked her, singled her out to be their vessel of retribution. She pressed on until she found a small clearing sheltered by a large oak and bedded down against its trunk. Her cloak wrapped about her shoulders to ward off the biting chill. She was used to uncomfortable nights. She had spent too many of them on the run. The memories drifted in. Harrenhal, the Red Wedding, the Hound, the horrors she had witnessed. Some nights, she thought she heard the Hound's rough voice mocking her in her dreams, telling her she was too small, too weak to survive. But she had survived somehow. The stark truth was that she had walked through corridors of death again and again, always emerging bloodied but unbroken. She was not naive enough to think it luck. No, luck was too cheap a word. There was something else at play, something that guided her hand when it mattered most, and maybe left her drifting in uncertainty when it wished her to learn humility. As she sat with her back to the oak, she let her eyes close. The forest around her creaked and shifted, full of the subtle sounds of nocturnal life. Her breath slowed. She remembered the exercises taught by the kindly man in the House of Black and White, how to empty her mind, how to let her identity slip away. But she did not want to lose herself entirely tonight. Instead, she let her mind wander to the memories of her father's words. He had believed in the old gods, prayed beneath the heart tree in the God's Wood at Winterfell. She pictured him kneeling there, the solemn expression on his face lit by the torchlight that occasionally flickered through the leaves. Father would have known what this feeling meant, she thought. He might have explained why his youngest daughter felt such an uncanny tie to the wolf's blood and these ancient weirwoods. But he was gone, betrayed and executed before her eyes. That was what had begun her list, wasn't it? A child's fury at a cruel world. The wind sighed through the oak's branches, and Arya drifted into a light sleep. In her dream, she was once again near a weirwood tree. The world around her was stark and cold, the ground dusted with fresh snow. The carved face of the weirwood bled, and from the red sap emerged a wolf. No, a dire wolf. Its eyes gleaming gold, its fur a swirl of gray and white. The wolf bared its teeth at her, but she felt no fear. She knelt and laid a hand on its flank, and the wolf pressed back against her. She tasted blood on her tongue, warm and metallic, but she had not been bitten. Instead, the taste seemed to come from somewhere else, from the tension in the dream itself, as if it were the flavor of old grudges and half-forgotten vengeance. Then, in a swirl of snow and red leaves, the wolf spoke in a voice like 100 rustling branches. It whispered her name, Arya, and in that moment, she saw all the faces she had worn, all the men she had killed, all the pain that had carved its way into her heart. The vision was overwhelming, and she tried to step back, but the wolf and the weirwood were wrapped around her like a labyrinth of roots. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt she might drown in the centuries of memory that flooded her senses. When she jerked awake, her eyes opened upon the dark forest. The moon was higher now, shining through sparse clouds, and she was trembling, sweat slick on her forehead despite the cold. She bolted upright and glanced around, half expecting the direwolf or the weirwood face to be there in the real world. Of course, nothing stood before her but the silent trees. Yet her heart pounded, and the dream's echo lingered, as real as any kill she'd made. Maybe it wasn't just a dream. Perhaps the old gods themselves had brushed against her consciousness, reminding her of that vow etched so deeply into her that even the faceless men couldn't strip it away. She tried to slow her breathing, but the sense of unearthly closeness clung to her like a second skin. She couldn't stay here. She rose, gathering her sparse belongings, and set off into the forest. The sky was a deep midnight blue overhead, and though the moon cast some light, she walked more by instinct than sight. She felt the forest's presence pressing in around her, as though it pulsed with unseen watchers. Her footsteps were all but silent on the loamy ground. Her time in Bravos had taught her to navigate darkness, but no amount of training could teach her how to banish the sense of destiny that coiled around her. She thought of the names again, whispered them under her breath as if half in prayer. It had been a long time since she had recited them fully. The names felt like a comfort in the hush of the wood, yet they also felt weighted with the approval of something bigger than herself. An hour passed, or perhaps more, before she found a narrow road that snaked through the trees. The ruts and footprints suggested that travelers occasionally passed here, though not often. Any curiosity about who might be on the road vanished beneath her instinct to remain unseen. She slipped into the undergrowth and moved parallel to the road, keeping a watchful eye for torches or any sign of men. The last thing she needed was to encounter a band of outlaws or a stray patrol from whatever lord held power in these parts. Yet strangely, part of her felt an undercurrent of confidence. It was as if a subtle power had awakened inside her after the dream, and she felt sure she could face what came. Eventually, she heard distant voices, men speaking in rough tones. She slowed, careful to keep herself concealed. The moonlight revealed a trio of figures around a small campfire near the roadside. 2 men and a woman, from what she could see, all clad in patchwork leathers. Their gear looked mismatched, the hallmarks of hedge knights or bandits. Arya crept closer, sliding noiselessly through the undergrowth, until she could see the reflection of the flames dancing on their faces. They looked tired, dirty, but no more menacing than any other travelers in these uncertain times. Yet she did not move on. She found herself compelled to eavesdrop, a flicker of curiosity or perhaps an intuition that these 3 had something to do with her path. She huddled behind the trunk of a pine, straining to make out their conversation. "Not sure we should be heading north at all," the woman muttered, feeding the flames with a broken branch. "Word is the White Walkers are more than just rumors. I'd rather keep my head attached to my shoulders than see a white tear it off." One of the men, stocky and thick-necked, shrugged. "We got no choice. The war's done for now, but the Lannisters are tightening their hold. You saw what happened to them who refused the new taxes. I'd take my chances in the north with the dead. Might be kinder than dealing with the gold lions." The second man laughed, a hollow sound. "If the rumors are true, all of Westeros will be dealing with the dead soon enough. But we'll do better in the north if we can find some work. Stark men pay fair, or so they say. Better than cowering under some lion bannerman who thinks he's a king." Arya felt her heart jolt at the mention of Stark men. She had, for so long, felt disconnected from that identity. Yet the name Stark still called to her, a chord that resonated with her being. She stayed crouched, listening as they continued to grumble about the state of the realm. Occasionally, she heard mention of a rumor that a girl named Arya Stark, thought lost or dead, might still roam the countryside. She gripped the bark of the pine in a sudden, fierce tension. They spoke of her as though she were a ghost, or a rumor used by small folk to spin bedtime tales. The woman snorted at the notion. "If the girl's alive, I doubt it matters. She's just one more orphan in a land full of orphans." Arya let out a slow breath. These travelers meant her no specific harm, yet she still felt stung by how easily they dismissed the name Stark. A year ago, maybe more, she would have revealed herself on impulse. Now she knew better. There was power in her anonymity. There was freedom in being no one, or at least being someone unseen. She closed her eyes and listened to the crackle of the fire, feeling an old ache stir in her chest. Her father's face rose in her memory, gentle yet firm, the same face that had taught her the old ways in Winterfell's Godswood. She looked up at the shimmering leaves overhead, noticing how the moonlight kissed them silver, and for a heartbeat, she thought she sensed the watchful presence again. She withdrew, leaving the trio to their conversation. She would not approach them, had no reason to. People had a habit of betraying or underestimating her, and she had learned that both could be dangerous. Slipping away into the darkness, she continued along the road at a safe distance, occasionally glimpsing the campfire's glow through the trees until it dwindled to embers behind her. Once it was gone, she felt more alone than before, but also more certain that she was on a path the old gods had sanctioned, whether she wanted it or not. Her thoughts drifted to her time at the House of Black and White. She remembered the dim halls, the hush that never seemed to break, the still water in which she had once cast away her coins and her identity. She had learned how to move without being seen, how to use darkness and silence as weapons, how to slip into the skin of another. But she had also learned that there was a piece of Arya Stark that refused to die. Maybe it was the same part that the old gods had claimed as their own, marking her for survival. There were times she had resented it, times she had wanted to let go of her anger, of her need for vengeance, and simply become no one. But she had failed. Or perhaps she had succeeded at being exactly who she was meant to be, a killer blessed by ancient powers. The road wound northward, meandering along gentle slopes and crossing narrow streams. Occasionally, she found footprints in the mud or half-eaten scraps left by travelers. She saw signs of old battles, too, rusted swords half buried in the dirt, an abandoned shield marked with a house's sigil she didn't recognize, a scattering of bleached bones near the remains of a toppled wagon. War had ravaged the 7 kingdoms, leaving pockets of chaos and ruin in its wake. She forced herself not to dwell on the tragedies she passed. She had seen too many. Instead, she recited her names in her mind, a kind of mantra that kept her focused. Gregor Clegane was dead, courtesy of forces beyond her. Cersei Lannister, still alive somewhere in King's Landing. Island Payne, the mute headsman. The names were fewer now, but the hate was as potent as ever. Through her training, she had learned to channel that hatred into precision. Still, she sensed that with every life she took, a darker well opened within her. Yet something in her compelled it, perhaps demanded it, almost like a sacrament. It was the old gods whispering, blood for blood, justice for injustice, all debts paid. Just before dawn, she spotted the glow of firelight behind the slope of a small hill. This light was too large to be a simple traveler's camp. It illuminated the edge of the horizon, flickering in a broad, ominous glow. Her curiosity piqued. She advanced cautiously, slipping off the road and creeping through the sparse cover of scraggly bushes until she reached the crest of the hill. Below, in a shallow valley, a settlement burned. It was little more than a cluster of wooden huts around a larger building, perhaps a holdfast. Flames danced, casting wicked silhouettes that lapped hungrily at the timbers. She could hear distant shouting, the clamor of steel on steel. A muffled scream reached her ears, and she crouched, adrenaline spiking. This was no ordinary accident. The settlement was under attack. Figures darted among the flames, chaos swirling. She saw at least a dozen men in rough attire, brandishing swords and axes, cutting down anyone who stood in their path. Among them were some local defenders, but they appeared hopelessly outnumbered. Arya pressed her body closer to the ground, mind racing. She could walk away and leave these strangers to their fate. It would be easier, safer. But she thought of her father's voice in her head, the old lessons of honor. She also thought of the dream, the direwolf, the weirwood. The old gods had shown her the power of vengeance. But she also remembered the code her father had lived by, the memory of the man who had taught her right from wrong. She clenched her jaw and felt that familiar surge in her veins, an emotion that was part wolf blood, part righteous fury. She would not abandon these people. She scrambled down the slope under the cover of darkness, keeping her movements fluid and silent. Smoke billowed, carrying the acrid stench of burning wood and flesh. Her eyes watered as she drew closer. She could make out a knot of bandits cornering a pair of frightened villagers near a well. Without hesitation, Arya reached for the small dagger strapped to her waist. She moved around the side of a broken fence, pressing her back against a half-collapsed barn. The night pulsed with heat, and the roar of flames was punctuated by screams and desperate shouts. Two of the bandits lunged at the villagers, a man and a woman clutching a child. Arya exploded into action. She closed the distance, her footsteps masked by the tumult. With one swift movement, she slit the throat of the nearest bandit, his eyes going wide as he pitched forward. The second bandit whirled, raising a rusty sword. She ducked under the swing, pivoting with cat-like grace, then drove her dagger into his side. He let out a sharp cry, staggered, and collapsed. The villagers stared in horror, then recognition of salvation dawned on their faces. "Run!" she hissed, waving them off. The man nodded, grabbed the child, and sprinted toward a small cluster of barrels that offered some cover. The woman lingered a second longer, staring at Arya with a mix of gratitude and fear, before darting after them. Arya scanned the chaos, her heart hammering. More raiders charged through the settlement, looting what they could, slaughtering those who resisted. She navigated the labyrinth of burning huts, stepping over bodies, ignoring the terror in her chest that told her to flee. Her father's ghost seemed to walk beside her, telling her that even in a world gone mad, there was room for courage. She spotted another group of bandits forcibly dragging a young boy from a burning building. The boy screamed and thrashed, tears cutting trails through his soot-smeared face. Her grip tightened around her dagger. This would be a risk, she was outnumbered. But she could not stand by. She emerged from the shadows, her dagger flashing. One of the bandits, a tall brute with a scarred face, turned just in time to block her attack with a crude axe. Metal rang against metal. Arya danced back, her small frame and speed giving her an advantage. The brute swung again. She dodged, feeling the air whistle past. The second bandit, a wiry man with crooked teeth, lunged for her. She parried his strike with practiced ease, spinning low and raking her dagger across his thigh. He howled, stumbling. The brute came in again, more cautiously this time. She recognized the glint of bloodlust in his eyes. It reminded her of men she had seen in Harrenhal, men who took pleasure in cruelty. She let that anger feed her. He rushed her, and she fainted to the side, letting him overextend. In a heartbeat, her dagger sank into his kidney. He twisted, roaring in pain, trying to bring the axe around. She wrenched the blade free, sidestepped, and slammed it under his ribs. His roar broke into a wet gurgle, and he collapsed, clutching at the blood spreading on his tunic. The wiry man tried to scramble away, panic in his eyes. She caught him with a slash to the back of his neck, severing vital tendons. He dropped, twitching. She spared a glance for the boy, who had crawled behind some rubble. "Go!" she shouted. The boy wasted no time disappearing into the darkness. Smoke stung her throat, and her eyes burned. She heard more screams from the far side of the settlement. Though she wanted to save as many as she could, a new presence tugged at her senses, a silent beckoning that felt like a cord in her skull. She followed it, crossing through the courtyard of the holdfast, careful to keep low. Her skin prickled. Something or someone drew her toward the heart of this inferno. Flames danced up the wooden walls, sending sparks into the star-flecked sky. Screams echoed, then died away. She spotted a figure standing in the center of the courtyard, holding a torch. His face was half hidden by the glare, but she could see a cruel smile twisting his lips. Around him lay bodies, villagers, maybe half a dozen. He wore no sigil. Arya slowed. He felt familiar, though she couldn't place him. He shouted to his men, voice booming through the carnage, "Flush out the rest, and bring me any valuables before you burn them. We'll teach these fools what it costs to hide from the real powers in this land." Arya's blood turned to ice. She realized she recognized him from Harrenhal, one of the lower-ranked men who had served the Lannisters. The memory was hazy, overshadowed by so many horrors, but she never forgot a face that had mocked the North. He'd been part of Gregor Clegane's retinue, if she recalled correctly, tormenting prisoners for sport. Rage simmered beneath her skin. If she ever needed confirmation that her kill list was guided by more than chance, this was it. She had not spoken this man's name in years, perhaps because she had never known it. But his face had imprinted itself upon her soul the day he had laughed as a man from the Riverlands was tortured. She felt the old gods, or something like them, urging her forward. This was a debt that needed paying. Her approach was swift and silent. She circled behind the man, using the flames and debris for cover. He was busy barking orders, unaware of the young woman who moved like a specter in the night. She crept closer, her heart pounding in her chest. She thought she heard the wind in the trees beyond the courtyard, but it could have been the old gods whispering in her ear. She was close enough now to see the sneer on his face, the fan of wrinkles that deepened around his eyes when he grinned at the suffering around him. He dropped the torch onto a pile of straw, letting the flames spread anew. She emerged from the smoke, dagger in hand, eyes cold. He turned at the last instant, surprise flickering in his gaze. "Who?" he began, but Arya didn't let him finish. She lunged, aiming for his throat. He stumbled back in alarm, fumbling for his sword. His reflexes were not as dull as she hoped. He managed to catch her blade on the steel of his half-drawn weapon. Sparks flew. Arya snarled, pushing her weight forward, but the man was larger and shoved her back. She rolled with the momentum, keeping her footing. He brandished the sword fully now, a savage grin returning to his face. "Little girl," he spat, "you've made a mistake, though you fight well for a whelp." Arya said nothing. She circled him, eyes narrowed, steps deliberate. The swirling smoke and the roar of the fire made the courtyard a hellish stage, the perfect place for this confrontation. He swung at her, testing her defenses. She parried, her dagger deflecting the blow, but the force of the impact numbed her arm. She darted to the side, trying to find an opening, but he advanced relentlessly. "You've got some skill," he taunted. "Who taught you? Some Bravosi whore?" He laughed cruelly. She didn't rise to the bait, instead letting him talk. Words had always been the weapons of the fearful. She kept her stance, remembering the lessons from the House of Black and White and Siriofarl before that. She was water dancing now, or as close to it as she could manage without a proper sword. She feinted to her left. He took the bait, lunging for what he thought was an easy strike. She pivoted right, hooking his ankle with her foot, trying to topple him. But he was too heavy, and though he stumbled, he stayed upright. He swung wildly, forcing her back. The tip of his blade nicked her shoulder, hot blood soaking into her sleeve. She winced but did not falter. She crouched low, circling him again. The fire crackled, sending sparks raining down like a twisted parody of snowfall. She heard the screaming of other villagers but forced herself to stay focused on the man before her. Let the rest handle themselves, she thought grimly. She could not save everyone, but she could do what she did best: bring judgment on those who deserved it. He lunged again. She dropped under his swing and slashed upward. Her dagger found purchase, slicing into the underside of his wrist. He roared in pain, his sword dropping from his spasming fingers. She leapt to capitalize on his mistake, driving her blade toward his heart. But he was not done. With his uninjured hand, he caught her wrist. He was strong, too strong for her to break free immediately. They grappled, the dagger quivering between them. Spittle flecked his lips as he snarled, "I'll gut you for this, bitch!" He twisted, trying to wrench the dagger from her hand. She let out a growl of effort, forcing her knee up between them. She slammed it into his groin. He grunted, his grip weakening for a split second. Enough time for her to slip free and bury the dagger in his chest. His breath hitched. She saw the realization in his eyes. He staggered back, and she yanked the blade free, a dark gush following it. She stared him down as he sank to his knees, his mouth opening and closing like a fish starved of air. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "You crossed paths with the wrong girl." Then, as he fell forward, dead, she felt a pulse deep in her core, a flash of heat that felt almost holy. This, she realized, was the old gods claiming what was theirs, channeling her fury and granting her the strength to enact their justice. The courtyard was a cacophony of flames, collapsing timbers, and agonized cries. Arya stepped over the body, her gaze flicking around. Most of the bandits had fled or fallen. A few scattered survivors fought the last defenders, but the holdfast was lost to the fire, and the villagers who remained were either running or hiding. She felt a sense of exhaustion crash over her, both physical and emotional. Yet at the same time, a grim satisfaction hummed in her veins. How many men like him had she killed? Each life ended was a step closer to avenging her family, or so she had believed as a child. But the list never grew shorter, not truly. Every victory only revealed another name. Then she felt it again, that intangible presence, a stirring at the edge of her mind. This time it was stronger, as if the barrier between mortal and divine had thinned in the heat of battle. Her vision swam, and for an instant, she thought she saw the weirwood from her dream towering above her, its leaves dripping blood in the firelight. She blinked, and the illusion vanished, replaced by the collapsing roof of the holdfast. She realized she had to move or be trapped. Slipping away through the chaos, she skirted the worst of the flames, ignoring the scattered pleas of the dying. In another life, she might have tried to help them. Now, her every instinct screamed to get out before the entire place became an inferno. She bolted for the far side of the settlement, zigzagging between burning huts. Her lungs burned, and her eyes stung from the thickening smoke. At last, she broke free into the open fields beyond. She ran until her legs faltered, then collapsed onto her knees, gulping the fresh night air that tasted of dew and charred embers. She stayed there for what felt like an eternity, letting her heart settle. Dawn was inching its way up the horizon now, painting the sky in muted pinks and purples. The frantic pulse in her veins began to calm, though the wound on her shoulder throbbed. She'd have to tend it soon, but first, she just needed to breathe. She gazed back at the settlement. Flames still licked the sky, but the screams had died away, replaced by the hollow crackle of burning wood. The survivors, if there were any, would face the dawn in a nightmare of ashes. Arya closed her eyes, feeling grief and anger churn in her gut. This was the world she lived in, one where the strong preyed on the weak, and justice was a fleeting dream. But she had made some difference tonight, saved a few souls from slaughter. The old gods might not speak with gentle mercy, but they had guided her hand toward retribution. She rose, checking the wound on her shoulder. It was shallow but bled steadily. She could manage it if she found some cloth and water. Glancing around, she spotted a small creek winding through the field. With heavy steps, she made her way there, kneeling by the bank. She rinsed the wound, hissing at the sting of cold water against raw flesh. She tore a strip of cloth from her tunic and bound it, tying it tight enough to staunch the flow. The entire time, she felt that subtle hum under her skin, the same hum she'd sensed whenever she touched a weirwood or dreamed of Nymeria. It was as though her rage and her resolve fed into a cosmic channel, a river older and deeper than anything the Red Faith or the Seven could claim. Once she finished dressing her wound, she rose and followed the creek upstream, her boots squelching in the muddy bank. The glow of dawn revealed a countryside scarred by war. Charred stumps, abandoned farmland, a half-toppled scarecrow leaning at a forlorn angle. Crows pecked at something in a distant field. Arya's stomach twisted, but she refused to look too closely. Her memories of the War of the Five Kings left her with no illusions about what crows usually feasted upon. After some time, she found a place where the creek widened into a shallow pool, ringed by rocks. She paused to drink and wash her face, scrubbing away the ash that clung to her skin. Her reflection shimmered back at her, distorted by the moving water. She saw a gaunt young woman, her eyes too old for her years, her hair cropped raggedly. There was dried blood on her collar, soot staining her cheeks. She wondered if her mother or her sister would even recognize her now. She wondered if she recognized herself. Each time she stared into a mirror or water's reflection, she half expected to see a stranger's face looking back. Sometimes in Bravos she had, but now she saw only Arya Stark, and behind her eyes, she thought she saw the swirl of something ancient and fierce. She drank until her thirst was quenched, then continued north, letting the dim rising sun guide her. The road was behind her. She preferred to travel away from well-trodden paths. She felt safer beneath the canopy of scattered forests or in the open fields where she could see trouble coming. As she walked, her mind drifted to the stories of the old gods again. She recalled that they demanded no temples, no septs, only the quiet devotion of those who knelt before heart trees and swore their vows in the presence of living nature. It made sense that they would mark her if indeed they had. She was a creature of silence and shadows, a force of nature, a wolf among sheep when it came to vengeance. The thought unsettled her, but it also gave her a sense of belonging, a dark reassurance that she was not alone. Her shoulder ached, and her limbs grew weary, but she pressed on. By midday, she reached another swath of woodland. These trees were younger than the ones she had passed through before, mostly oaks and birches that let in dappled sunlight. She heard the chatter of a stream not far ahead and decided to seek a place to rest. Along the way, she found remnants of an old campsite, its fire pit cold and ringed with stones. She settled there, gathering a bit of kindling to make a small fire of her own. Her hands moved automatically, repeating the motions she'd done 1,000 times on the road. Soon, a modest flame crackled, enough to provide warmth and a sense of comfort. She opened the small pouch at her belt, retrieving the last of her dried bread and salted meat. As she chewed, she wondered if she could stay off the main routes entirely. Moving unseen was safest, especially now that chaos gripped the land like a fever. But a bigger question nagged at her. Where was she heading? The list of names in her mind had grown shorter, but the greatest threat, Circe, remained in King's Landing, a viper coiled in her den of power. Arya knew it would be suicide to march into the capital alone, not after all that had transpired. Still, the part of her that the old gods had touched whispered that their mark would protect her. Was that belief or folly? She wasn't sure. A breeze rustled the branches overhead, sending a swirl of leaves onto her makeshift campsite. She stared into the fire, thinking. The House of Black and White had taught her that death was the equalizer, that every living thing must serve it in time. But the old gods had shown her something else, a more personal, ancient sense of justice that demanded retribution for wrongs done, which was she meant to uphold. She pressed her lips together, swallowing her last bite of salted meat. Perhaps the truth was that she could be both, a disciple of the many-faced gods, impartial embrace of death, and a wolf answering the call of the old gods. If that were so, then she was neither wholly mortal nor divine, but some bridging force between them. The notion felt too large to digest, so she pushed it aside. The sun rose higher, the day warming slightly. She stifled a yawn, exhaustion pulling at her. She had not slept well, and the fight at the burning settlement had sapped her strength. She let the fire burn down, then covered the embers with dirt to avoid attracting unwanted attention. Stretching out on a patch of grass, she set her pack for a pillow. She kept her dagger close, resting a hand on its hilt. As she closed her eyes, she wondered if she would dream of wolves and weirwoods again. A hint of dread curled in her belly, but she was too tired to resist sleep. When it came swiftly. The forest sounds lulled her. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant babble of water. Her dream began in blackness, a silent, endless void. Then, slowly, she saw a faint red glow, pulsing like a heartbeat. She moved toward it, or perhaps it moved toward her. The glow expanded, revealing itself to be the carved face of a weirwood, massive and looming. It bled tears of red sap that glistened like rubies in the darkness. Voices swirled around her, echoing, merging. Old voices, new voices, voices of the dead and living alike. They chanted a single word, though she could not understand the language. Or perhaps it was a name that resonated in her chest like a second heartbeat. She became aware of footsteps beside her. She turned, and there was a figure clad in gray fur, a hood pulled low over their face. The figure lifted its head, revealing Arya's own features, but older, the face of a woman etched with lines of grief and fury. The double stared at her, expression inscrutable. Then its eyes turned golden, wolfish, and the figure smiled. Arya felt a tremor, sensing that something impossible was about to be revealed. The dream weirwood's face cracked, and from the crack poured a flood of darkness that engulfed them both. She woke with a gasp, heart pounding. The sun had shifted in the sky, perhaps an hour or more had passed. She sat up, disoriented, her clothes damp with sweat. The forest was quiet except for the occasional chirp of a bird. She rubbed her eyes, the dream's images fading but the sense of awe lingering. She felt a sudden urgency, as though a hidden truth was at her fingertips if only she could grasp it. Maybe the old gods were telling her that her journey would not end with a simple kill list. Perhaps there was a reason she had endured so many trials, a destiny that extended beyond revenge. The thought frightened her more than any assassin or soldier could. Steadying her nerves, she gathered her belongings and moved on. The day wore on in a slow rhythm. She foraged for what she could find: mushrooms near rotting logs, a few edible berries from a wild bush. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her that she needed proper supplies soon. She kept her eyes open for any sign of a farm or a village. War had laid waste to so many places, but there were still pockets of life if one knew where to look. The land itself felt bruised, but not entirely broken. After trudging through the woods, she emerged onto a slight rise overlooking a grassy valley. A narrow river wound through it, its waters glittering in the mid-afternoon sun. Near the bend of the river stood a dilapidated mill house. She could see a wheel half submerged and broken. It looked abandoned, yet a column of thin smoke curled from what might have once been a chimney. Arya hesitated. This could be a trap or it could be a refuge. She weighed her options, her survival instincts battling her curiosity. In the end, she decided to investigate cautiously. She approached from the rear, skirting around the edge of the property. The mill house was indeed in poor repair. Holes in the roof, cracked windows, the wheel lying in disuse. But the smoke suggested someone had made it a shelter. She crept closer, crouching behind a patch of tall grass. Through a grimy window, she glimpsed movement inside. A figure or maybe two. Hard to tell. She circled around, testing the ground with each step to avoid making noise. Finally, she found a gap in the wall, where a plank had rotted away. She peered through and saw a single occupant, an old man with a scraggly beard, stirring a small pot over a makeshift hearth. He was alone from what she could see and did not appear armed. Her stomach twisted with hunger at the sight of potential food. He muttered to himself, something Arya couldn't catch. She considered her approach. Should she reveal herself as a traveler in need of aid, or sneak in to take what she needed? The old man didn't look threatening, but looks could be deceiving. Her father's teaching nudged her conscience. He would have helped if he could done the honorable thing. Then again, her father's honor had gotten him killed. Still, she decided to try a peaceful approach first. Keeping her dagger at the ready, she moved around to the sagging door and rapped softly. The old man started, then coughed. "Who's there?" he croaked. Arya pressed her lips together. Her voice came out hoarse. "A traveler. Alone." Moments passed. Then the door creaked open a fraction, revealing the man's face, lined with age and suspicion. He eyed her, taking in her ragged clothes, the dagger in her hand. "Got nothing worth stealing," he said. "If you're a bandit, you'll find slim pickings here." "I'm no bandit," Arya replied, though she realized how it might look. She lowered the dagger, but not so low as to be careless. "I just need some food, maybe a place to rest." He grunted. Well, come in if you want. I got no reason to stop you." He moved back, allowing her to slip inside. The interior was dim, lit only by the sun filtering through cracks in the walls. The hearth was a stone circle with a small fire that smoked more than it burned. The smell of thin stew wafted in the air. A battered table and 2 stools comprised the only furniture. Arya stepped in, scanning for threats. She saw a hunting bow propped in a corner, but no quiver. The old man shuffled back to his pot, stirring listlessly. He sniffed and shot her a sidelong glance. You look half-starved. I can share some stew, if you're minded to keep your blade where it is." She nodded, slipping the dagger back into its sheath. "I have coin," she offered. His laugh was a dry bark. "What good's coin to me? You want to pay? Bring me some firewood, or catch a fish or two in the river." He waved at a small net near the door. "I ain't so spry these days." Arya felt an unexpected surge of gratitude. In a land torn by war, small kindnesses were rare. She set her pack down near the wall. "I can do that." She eyed the pot. "What's in it?" He gave a half-shrug. "Bits of rabbit, some roots I dug up. Tastes better than it smells, if that's any consolation." He poured a portion into a crude wooden bowl. Arya took it, nodding her thanks. She realized how hungry she was the moment she lifted the bowl to her lips. The stew was thin, watery, but the morsels of rabbit provided enough flavor to make it feel like a feast. She ate quickly, mindful not to appear too desperate but unable to hide her ravenous appetite. The old man watched her, his gaze flickering over the bandage on her shoulder. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she murmured between bites. "Just a scratch." He tapped a crooked finger on the table. "Looks more than a scratch. You get that in battle?" Arya shrugged, not wanting to reveal too much. "Ran into some trouble on the road. That's all." He studied her in silence. In the flicker of the hearth, she saw something like pity in his eyes. "Times are hard," he said at last. "Bandits, soldiers, all the same to me. They take what they want." He paused, as if weighing the wisdom of speaking further. "You've killed men." Arya froze mid-bite. The stew dripped from her spoon back into the bowl. She swallowed, then met his eyes. "Yes." He nodded, unsurprised. "You're too young for that burden." Before she could respond, he took the spoon from his pot, turned back to the hearth, and ladled himself a small portion. His hands trembled slightly, showing his age. "I was a miller once. Had a wife, 2 daughters. Then the war came. Wolves at the door, lions at the gate, dragons overhead. All the same to me now, just different ways to die. My family's gone. I stay here because it's my home." He sipped, grimacing at the taste. "You're from the north, by your accent." She stiffened. "I might be." He gave a dry chuckle. "No reason to fear an old man's questions. I can see the north in your eyes anyway. You have that look, cold and determined." Arya didn't reply, finishing the last of her stew. She felt slightly warmer, a little more at ease, but her instincts remained sharp. She set the bowl down. "Thank you. I'll fetch that firewood now." He nodded, gesturing to the door. "There's an axe out back, if it ain't too dull." Stepping outside, she found a small chopping block near a pile of logs. The axe was indeed dull, but she managed to split enough wood to keep the hearth burning for a day or two. With each swing, she felt a twinge in her shoulder, but she worked through it, letting the physical labor occupy her mind. She thought of how fleeting such moments of normalcy were, how easily they could be snatched away by the next band of marauders. When she returned inside, arms loaded with wood, the old man was dozing on one of the stools, his bowl empty beside him. She quietly stacked the wood near the hearth, then hesitated. Maybe it was time to slip away. Yet something tugged at her conscience, an unexpected sense of responsibility. This man had offered her kindness without demanding payment. She debated whether she should stand guard for the night or simply move on. As she watched him sleep, lines of weariness etched into his face. She found she could not leave just yet. She decided to stay until morning if he would allow it. Standing guard might ease her conscience. She recalled a time when she had yearned for someone to watch over her while she slept, to keep the terrors at bay. The old gods might mark her for survival, but there was still something profoundly human in yearning for safety. Perhaps by offering the same to this old man, she could repay a fraction of the many debts she carried. Outside, the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the valley. She wondered if the old man had any idea of the powers that might shift and stir in the night, of the gods who might choose champions or instruments for their will. Probably not. Most men lived and died without glimpsing the deeper tides that shaped the realm. Arya thought that once, she too had been blind. But now, every time she closed her eyes, she felt the hush of an ancient forest, heard the whisper of her name from a bleeding weirwood. She had become more than just Arya Stark. She had become a spark of old magic in a land that was forgetting its myths. For the rest of the evening, she and the old man shared few words. She tended her shoulder more thoroughly, using some boiled water and a scrap of clean cloth he provided. The dull ache lingered, but it would heal in time, as so many of her wounds had. They ate a bit more stew, conversation minimal but companionable. When darkness fell, she took her place at the door, peering through a gap in the boards at the moonlit yard. The old man lay on a pile of rags in the corner, soon snoring softly. Night deepened. Arya remained vigilant, her senses tuned to every rustle of wind, every distant cry of a night bird. She recited the kill list in her mind, though it felt heavier each time she spoke it. When she reached the end, she paused, thinking of the unnamed man she had slain that night in the burning settlement. He had been on her mental list for a long time, even if she had never known his name. Another life ended, another piece of her soul chipped away. Yet the old gods did not mourn such brutality. They only demanded that the strong do what must be done, or so it seemed to her. Eventually, her eyes grew heavy. She drifted in and out of a light doze, leaning against the wall. Sometime after midnight, she thought she heard a voice near her ear, a faint whisper that made her spine tingle. She jerked awake, scanning the room. The old man still slept, the coals in the hearth a dull glow. The voice, if it had been real, was gone. Perhaps it was just another dream. She kept her vigil until dawn, and nothing stirred outside except for a fox that scampered by the broken mill wheel. At first light, she gently roused the old man. He looked at her with a bleary gaze. "You're still here. I half thought you'd run off." She mustered a small smile. "I owed you for the stew." He shrugged. "You needed rest. I guess we both got what we needed." He rubbed the stiffness from his joints, his gaze wandering to the door. "You'll be leaving then?" "Yes." She shouldered her pack, checking that her bandage was secure. "If you ever need anything," she hesitated, knowing full well she might never return. She had no idea what future awaited her. The old man offered a nod, not pressing. "You've done me a kindness by not killing me," he said wryly, though his tone held no bitterness. "Safe travels, northern girl." She slipped out into the cool morning air. The sky was streaked with pale gold, a thin mist hanging over the river. She headed north again, spurred on by an instinct she could barely name. Perhaps it was destiny, or perhaps it was the old gods guiding her steps. The events of the previous day, the burning settlement, the dream of the weirwood, lingered in her mind, shaping her resolve. She would continue her journey, even if she didn't know precisely where it would end. As the morning warmed, the mist dissolved, revealing rolling hills and occasional copses of trees. She took to crossing fields when possible, avoiding the roads. Though she sometimes felt a pull to see more signs of life, to know that Westeros still breathed, caution kept her at a distance. Along the way, she passed a few abandoned farmsteads, their fields gone to seed. Once, she spotted a band of travelers in the distance, but she ducked behind a low stone wall until they were gone. By midday, she found herself climbing a gentle slope that offered a vantage point of the surrounding lands. The panorama was both beautiful and heartbreaking. She could see for miles. Meadows dotted with wildflowers, a thick forest to the northeast, and a long ridge of mountains in the far distance. But she also saw the scar of war. Burned patches of earth, blackened skeletons of trees, a half-collapsed tower on a nearby hill. She inhaled slowly, letting the breeze ruffle her hair. Sometimes she imagined what Winterfell might be like now with Jon or Sansa or Bran. Would they welcome her back if she returned? Or would they see the many faces she had worn, the many lives she had taken, and shrink away? She sensed a presence behind her. Arya whirled, dagger in hand. But there was no one, only the faint rustle of the wind through the grass. She exhaled, feeling foolish. The dreams and the near-death encounters had put her on edge. Yet she couldn't shake the impression that she was being watched by eyes beyond mortal sight. The old gods watched through the weirwoods, it was said, seeing everything that happened in their domain. She pictured 1,000 carved faces, silently judging, or maybe guiding. She clipped her dagger back to her belt and continued down the slope, heading toward a patch of forest that promised both cover and the possibility of game. Entering the shade of the trees felt like stepping into another world. The sunlight filtered in soft beams through the canopy, and the air held a damp, loamy scent. Leaves crunched beneath her boots, and the faint songs of birds echoed high overhead. She found a narrow animal trail and followed it deeper. Here she thought she might catch a rabbit or a squirrel if she set a snare. She scanned the ground for tracks. A few minutes in, she paused at the sight of something bright and out of place. A blood-red leaf. Her heart skipped. She pushed aside a thicket of brambles and saw it. A weirwood sapling, perhaps no taller than her waist, its bark a pale white, its leaves crimson as fresh blood. It wasn't carved, being so young, and yet she felt the same eerie resonance as if she stood before an ancient heart tree. She knelt, staring at it. The presence she had felt since her dream seemed to surge, prickling at the back of her neck. Carefully, she placed a hand on the slender trunk. This time, the sensation was subtler but still potent, a warm hum passing from the wood into her fingers. She closed her eyes, inhaling the forest's breath. In her mind, she saw glimpses of swirling visions. The bone-white trunk of a fully grown weirwood, the face carved into it, weeping tears of red, and beyond it, the vastness of a nighttime sky with swirling constellations. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt, rather than heard, a voice. Grow. Become. Remember. When she opened her eyes, her heart was racing. She felt a strange mixture of awe and fear. If the old gods were real, and she no longer doubted that, then they were speaking through these living symbols. The sapling before her was like an infant deity, brimming with ancient potential. She let go of the trunk, stepping back. The hush of the forest pressed in around her. She felt changed by even this brief contact, as if her role in the great tapestry of Westeros had been reaffirmed. She continued deeper into the woods, her thoughts swirling. Night would fall again soon, and she would need to find shelter. But the presence of the sapling lingered in her mind, fueling her sense that she was walking a path laid out long ago. The notion that she was marked by the old gods didn't feel so far-fetched anymore. Her survival, her uncanny luck, the kill list that she carried like a sacred vow, all of it might be the will of something older than men or even dragons. Perhaps the entire realm was moving toward a reckoning, and she was merely one of many instruments. The idea both humbled and emboldened her. She wasn't alone, not truly. She was connected to the deep, ancient roots that spanned from Winterfell's Godswood to every corner of the north and beyond. By dusk, she found a secluded glade where she could set up a small camp. She snared a rabbit, offering a silent prayer of thanks to whatever power watched over her. As she cooked the meat over a modest fire, she thought again of her kill list. Would she add new names to it, or would she finally see it through? Each name was a debt, a promise. And though the many-faced god might say that all men must die eventually, Arya Stark knew that some deaths had to be delivered by mortal hands. Maybe that was her part in the grand design. She couldn't say how it would end, only that she would keep moving forward as long as she drew breath. The old gods had set her on this path, and she would walk it until there were no more steps to take. Night enveloped the forest, and she pulled her cloak tight. Tomorrow she would press on. The road or the wilderness. Somehow it hardly mattered, as long as she stayed true to the unspoken call in her blood. She recited the names softly, her voice merging with the crackle of the fire. This time, she felt neither anger nor desperation. She felt only resolve. And perhaps that was the true mark of the old gods. Not fury, but purpose. A purpose as deep and unyielding as the roots of the heart trees. As she drifted off to sleep, Arya dreamed again, of a vast weirwood forest that stretched from horizon to horizon. On each tree bearing a carved face that looked upon her with silent, bleeding eyes. The wind sighed through the crimson leaves, and in that sigh, she thought she heard the names from her list echo back at her, fused with the chanting of an ancient language. Each name rang like a note in a long-forgotten dirge. And through it all, a wolf prowled at her side, its fur mingling with the shadows, golden eyes watching. She felt no fear of it, only kinship. When she woke in the first silver light of dawn, she felt an unspoken certainty. The kill list was more than her vendetta. It was part of something older, something that demanded blood for blood, a final tally of the wrongs done to House Stark and the North. Whether it ended with her blade at Cersei's throat or carried on into battles yet unimagined, she would keep following the path set before her. She was Arya Stark, and she was also something more, a living instrument of the old gods, marked by them in ways that transcended mortal understanding. She would survive and she would kill until the shape of her destiny was fulfilled. And in the quiet corners of Westeros where the heart trees stood in silent vigil, blood-red leaves trembling in the wind, it was said that if you listened closely, you could hear the distant echo of her footsteps as she passed, guided by forces no man could tame, forging a legend that would outlive even the old gods themselves. Arya Stark woke to a pearlescent dawn spreading across the forest floor, the sun's early rays turning the dew-drenched leaves to glistening emeralds. The small fire she had built the night before had died down to faint wisps of smoke, and the remnants of the rabbit she had cooked lay scattered near the ashes. Rising from her makeshift bedding, little more than a threadbare cloak over packed earth, she winced at the stiff ache in her shoulder. She checked the bandage, ensuring that no fresh blood seeped through, then carefully rolled her arm in its socket. The pain was manageable. She had endured worse. She stowed her belongings with brisk efficiency, dousing the smoldering embers with dirt until only the faintest tendril of warmth remained beneath her boots. She listened to the hush of the forest. The wind wove through the branches overhead, and small creatures rustled in the underbrush. A sense of anticipation coiled in her stomach, not entirely unpleasant. The dream from the previous night lingered, a weirwood forest unending, each heart tree bearing a carved face that seemed to watch her. She felt no fear in the dream, only a strange acceptance, as if she had stepped onto a path that stretched beyond mortal sight. She reminded herself that the path forward was uncertain, always uncertain, but the old gods had carried her this far. She would trust that quiet pull in her blood. She set off, threading through the thick trunks, choosing her steps with the practiced grace that years of living as a fugitive had carved into her bones. Shafts of early sunlight slanted between branches, igniting motes of dust that danced in the stillness. As she walked, she found her thoughts drifting to Winterfell. She wondered if Sansa was there, or Bran, or Jon. She recalled the rumor she had overheard days before, that the White Walkers were more than myth and might soon threaten all of Westeros. If that rumor was true, then the night that spanned beyond the wall was on the march. Part of her longed to see her family again, to stand beneath the heart tree in the Godswood, to hear the hush of snow falling on the ramparts. But she had more immediate matters at hand. Names yet to be crossed off her list, debts of blood older than she cared to admit. After some time, the forest thinned. The ground rose in gentle hills, scattered with shrubs and patches of tall grass. The breeze carried a faint tang of water and marsh. She spotted a low swath of land where reeds stood in thick clumps, the spongy earth shimmering with pooled water. Beyond lay the vestiges of a gravel road, half buried in mud. She hesitated before stepping onto it, scanning both directions for any sign of travelers. Nothing stirred except a lone heron picking its way through the marsh. With a measured sigh, she ventured forward, heading north by her best reckoning. Each step on the soft ground brought forth squelching sounds that might betray her presence if anyone were nearby, but she saw no tracks, neither will ruts nor hoofprints. War had drained the region of much of its life, leaving behind haunted emptiness. By midday, the sky had brightened to a bleached blue, and her stomach growled. She paused near a large rock, rummaging in her pack for whatever remained of her provisions. Only a tough crust of bread and a few salted strips of meat. She ate sparingly, aware that her meager stores would soon be gone. She drank from her waterskin, then wiped sweat from her brow, blinking at the glare of the sun. Across the marsh, a dragonfly flashed in iridescent brilliance, zipping across stagnant pools. If not for the memory of burned villages and marauding bandits, she might have found the scene almost peaceful. She pressed on. The day wore on in a steady cadence of careful steps and quiet vigilance. The weight of her memories settled on her shoulders as surely as any pack. Sometimes she found herself reciting the kill list in her head, each name a flint spark against the tinder of her emotions. Cersei Lannister, Island Payne, the mountain was gone. Slain in a twisted confrontation involving poison and dark sorceries, or so the rumors said. That knowledge brought her neither joy nor closure. Revenge robbed you of satisfaction more often than not. She had learned that truth in bravos, had felt the emptiness when a name dropped away, but she could not deny the compulsion. Each name was a tether, linking her to the promise she had made to herself, to her father's memory, to the old gods who might or might not be guiding her hand. Late in the afternoon, she emerged onto higher, drier ground, the marsh fading behind her. An outcropping of stone offered a vantage point from which she surveyed a broad valley. Fields of wild grass rippled in the distance, and a thin line of trees skirted the horizon. Far to the northeast, hazy peaks rose like silent sentinels. She guessed they were the foothills of the Mountains of the Moon territory near the Vale. If that guess was correct, then the riverlands stretched out behind her, battered and bruised by war but still clinging to life. A faint road curved around the valley's perimeter, marked by wooden posts that looked half-rotten. She noticed a few specks moving along it. Travelers, perhaps, or a small caravan. Too distant to determine their intentions, but enough to spark her caution. She descended from the outcropping and approached the road from a safe angle, keeping a line of brush between herself and any onlookers. The travelers drew closer, resolving into half a dozen people trudging beside a single ox-drawn cart. They appeared weary, their clothing ragged. Children clung to the sides of the cart, while two men walked in front, scanning the horizon nervously. Arya edged forward, her instincts warring with a twinge of empathy. They looked more like refugees than bandits. She might pass them without incident. But a part of her, the part that remembered the old man at the mill, wondered if these people might need help, or if they might have scraps of food to spare. She was reluctant to approach openly, especially after so many harsh lessons in trust. Yet, as she lingered, one of the children stumbled, falling to his knees with a faint cry. The cart lurched to a halt. A woman knelt, helping the boy stand, and Arya heard the faint murmur of a worried voice carried by the wind. They were exhausted, struggling under the pitiless sun. Something in Arya refused to simply vanish into the brush. Perhaps it was her father's ghost urging her, or the call of the old gods for compassion as well as vengeance. She couldn't be sure. She waited until the travelers resumed walking before circling around to intercept them from a slight rise. She kept her dagger sheathed at her belt, though her hand hovered near it. As she stepped from the cover of the brush, the group halted again. The men stiffened, hands drifting toward crude weapons. A spear of some kind, a pitchfork. The woman pulled the children behind her, eyes fearful. Arya lifted her hands, palms outward to show she meant no harm. "I'm alone," she called, her voice steady. "I'm just a traveler." One of the men, a wiry fellow with streaks of gray in his hair, stepped forward. "Stay back," he warned, though his tone held more anxiety than threat. "We've got nothing worth stealing. We're poor folk, heading north to find work." Arya nodded. "I'm not a thief." She kept her posture relaxed, scanning their faces. Their clothes were patched in multiple places, and the children looked underfed. "Where are you coming from?" "South," the man said curtly, refusing to elaborate. His companion, a taller man with hollow cheeks, said nothing, but his grip on the pitchfork tightened. The woman behind them clutched a shawl around her shoulders despite the heat. "The roads are dangerous," she said, her voice wavering. "We can't take any more trouble." Arya understood their fear. She had once been in their position, helpless, reliant on the mercy of strangers. She lowered her hands, letting her arms fall to her sides, doing her best not to appear threatening. "I came across some trouble myself," she said quietly. "I'm just looking for a safe path north. Same as you." The gray-haired man studied her, his gaze flicking to the dagger at her waist. Then he exhaled and nodded grudgingly. "We've heard rumors the north might be safer now, something about the Starks retaking Winterfell. Not sure how true that is, but it's got to be better than staying near the Lannisters." Arya's heart quickened at the mention of her family. She forced herself to maintain composure. "The Starks," she echoed. "What have you heard?" The man shrugged, glancing at the children. "Just travelers' gossip. Says Ned Stark's bastards or something put the Boltons to the sword. Hard to know what's truth these days." Ned Stark's bastards. The phrase twisted in Arya's chest. They must mean Jon Snow. The notion that Jon might hold Winterfell offered a rush of warmth, tempered by caution. Gossip was fickle, but if there was any chance her half-brother ruled Winterfell, it changed the shape of her path. Perhaps her rightful place was with her kin, if they would have her. Or perhaps not. She swallowed, nodding slowly. "Rumors can be misleading," she said. The tall man shifted his weight, looking over his shoulder. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice low. "No time to stand around. The children are tired, but we can't linger if we want to make the next village by nightfall." Arya glanced at the cart. The ox looked half-starved, the wheels caked in dried mud. Part of her wanted to walk away, but something deeper kept her there a moment longer. "I can help gather food," she offered, surprising even herself. "If you have snares or fishing lines, I can hunt. Then we can share it." A flicker of hope crossed the woman's face before caution replaced it. "Why?" she asked. "What do you want from us?" Arya thought of the miller who had shown her kindness. "I want to get to the north in one piece," she said. "We could travel together at least for a few days. Safety in numbers." She paused, lowering her voice. "And maybe it'll do us good to share what we can. The land's cruel enough." The travelers exchanged wary glances. Then the woman nodded, as did the two men. A silent agreement passed between them. The gray-haired man turned back to Arya. "All right then, but if you try anything—" "I won't," Arya assured him, though she kept her expression reserved. She understood their warning. Trust was fragile, something that had to be earned step by cautious step. They fell into a loose formation, the ox trudging heavily as the cart wheels creaked. Arya took up a position slightly off to the side, scanning the surrounding fields and tree lines. The children stared at her with round eyes but said nothing. She guessed the youngest might be 5 or 6, the older perhaps 8. They were gaunt, their faces smudged with dirt and fatigue. She felt a distant pang of sympathy, recalling how she had once been hungry and terrified, running through war-torn lands in search of a home that felt light years away. Their progress was slow, the day's heat bearing down on them. By mid-afternoon, they left the open fields for a winding path through another stand of woods. The tall man paused near a patch of ferns, pointing. "There might be a stream that way," he said. "We could use fresh water." The group veered from the path, forging a short distance into the undergrowth until they found a narrow brook with clear running water. The children rushed to drink, cupping the water in their hands. Arya slipped off, leaving the group behind, scanning the edge of the woods for signs of game. She moved quietly, her eyes alert for tracks or droppings. This forest was not as thick or old as some she had passed, but it still offered shadows and hidden hollows where small creatures might dwell. She found rabbit tracks near a cluster of berry bushes, along with fresh droppings. Carefully, she circled the area, spotting a faint depression in the earth that told her a warren might be nearby. She set a small snare, something the House of Black and White had never taught her, but she had picked up bits of woodland craft along her travels. Satisfied with the snare, she crouched among the bushes, waiting in silence. The hush of the forest enveloped her, broken only by the trickle of the brook and the occasional chirr of a cricket. Her mind wandered, drifting back to her dream visions of weirwoods and red-leafed branches stirring in an invisible wind. She wondered if the old gods truly watched her every move, or if they only stirred at pivotal moments, guiding her hand. Part of her still questioned how deeply she was entwined with that power, and whether she could ever be free of it if she wanted to be. Movement snagged her attention. A rabbit ventured from a thicket, sniffing the air. Its ears twitched warily, but it continued forward, drawn perhaps by the scent of something in the undergrowth. Arya remained perfectly still, breathing shallowly. She felt a small pang of guilt at the thought of taking its life, but the hunger in her belly and the children's faces pushed the sentiment away. The old gods might demand blood, but they also provided the necessity of the hunt. With a swift twitch, the rabbit triggered the snare, and the loop tightened. She leapt forward, ending its struggle with a quick slash of her dagger. Blood soaked the leaves. She exhaled, still crouched, feeling the old, familiar jolt that came whenever she took a life, no matter how small. Death always carried a weight. She wiped her blade on a patch of grass and gathered the rabbit, making sure she had it firmly in hand before heading back. When she returned to the stream, the travelers were preparing to move on. The children's eyes widened at the sight of fresh game. She crouched by the water, cleaning the rabbit as best she could, the red rivulets disappearing into the current. The woman offered a faint smile, shy gratitude shining in her tired gaze. They continued, turning back to the main path. The remainder of the day passed in uneasy camaraderie. The children grew bolder, occasionally asking Arya timid questions. How did she learn to hunt? Where was she from? She answered with guarded truths. She had learned to hunt a bit in her youth, and she came from the north, but did not mention House Stark. She wasn't yet ready to reveal her identity. The men, too, loosened somewhat, sharing that they had once been small folk under the rule of a minor lord who had pledged to the Tullus. But war had swept away all allegiances. Their land was seized, taxes doubled, and soon they found themselves with nothing but a cart and a stubborn ox. Toward sunset, they found a sheltered hollow near a bend in the stream to make camp. Arya helped gather wood, her instincts on alert for any sign of lurking bandits. The men started a small fire. The woman, who introduced herself as Myra, carefully skinned and cooked the rabbit with what little seasoning they had. The children huddled close to the flames, the day's exhaustion etched into their faces. Arya sat on the periphery, watchful, considering. For so long, she had traveled alone, trusting no one. Now she found herself among these weary souls who reminded her, in some small measure, of her lost innocence. They were not her friends, not her family, but the sense of shared humanity in the flickering firelight felt strangely comforting. They ate quietly. When the meal was done, Arya took the first watch, letting the travelers rest. She sat by the dying embers, knees drawn to her chest, scanning the dark forest. The hush of night enveloped them. Occasionally, a branch snapped in the distance or an owl hooted, sending the children into anxious stirring, but nothing threatened their camp. At one point, she heard the oldest child, a girl of perhaps 8, softly crying in her sleep. It tugged at Arya's heart, reminding her of all the nights she had spent trembling, alone, whispering her kill list as if it were a lullaby. She closed her eyes, letting the memory roll through her mind. The world had hardened her, but not so thoroughly that she felt no sympathy for the helpless. When her watch was done, she roused the gray-haired man, who muttered something unintelligible before taking her place by the embers. Arya wrapped herself in her cloak, lying near the cart, drifting into a shallow sleep. She half expected the dream to return. The endless weirwood forest, the wolf at her side. But her rest was dreamless, punctuated only by shifting shadows and the occasional drip of dew from leaves overhead. Morning arrived in a wash of gold and violet, the sky streaked with dawn's promise. They broke camp in weary silence, sharing a few leftover scraps of rabbit before pressing on. Arya remained near the front, scanning for potential threats. The tall man, who had eventually introduced himself as Garen, walked beside her. He was cautious in his speech, measuring his words. But after a time, he asked the question she had anticipated since they met. "You've got a look about you," he said quietly, so as not to wake the children dozing in the cart. Not just a common vagabond. You carry yourself like someone who's seen more than her share. Arya kept her eyes on the path. I've traveled a lot, she replied, non-committal. Garen nodded, not pressing immediately. They walked in silence for a few more minutes, the ox's hooves thudding against the dirt. Then he exhaled. You fight too, don't you? Hard to miss. You've got that tension in your shoulders, like you're always ready. Arya's lips twitched. When you've been hunted, you learn to hunt back. That was the closest she came to revealing the truth. He grunted. I don't want trouble for my family, you understand, but I'm grateful for what you did, the rabbit, the watch, all of it. If we reach the next village, I'll see if I can pay you somehow. No need, Arya said. She glanced back at the children, who stirred at the lull in the cart's movement but didn't fully awaken. The younger boy still had a bruise on his temple from where he'd fallen the day before. It's enough to know I might have helped a bit. Garen fell silent. Arya sensed a swirl of half-formed curiosity in his expression, but she gave him no further answers. The truth that she was Arya Stark of Winterf, marked by the old gods, a vessel of vengeance, would sound mad to these people. Or worse, it would draw the wrong kind of attention if repeated. So she kept it locked away. By late morning, they glimpsed a scattering of huts in the distance. A small village, or what remained of one. Smoke curled from a single chimney, and a field of neglected crops stretched beyond the huts, suggesting that half the population might have fled or died in the war. The group approached warily, tension spiking. The road here showed signs of use, though not heavily so, and a rickety fence surrounded a patch of what might once have been a vegetable garden. A lone figure emerged from one of the huts, leaning on a cane. As the ox-drawn cart drew near, the traveler lifted a hand in greeting. Arya spotted a battered sword hanging at the figure's hip, an old man, by the look of him, though not too frail to wield steel. He wore a threadbare cloak, and a hunting dog stood at his side, hackles raised. Halt! The old man called. Be you friend or foe? The gray-haired man in Arya's group, Bren, raised both hands. We're no foes, just travelers, looking for a place to rest and maybe a bit of trade. The old man eyed them. He made a signal to the dog, which relaxed somewhat. Not much to trade here, he muttered. But if you've coin or goods, there's a widow who sells goat's milk and bread, a young man who does blacksmith work. That's about it. We're a poor lot. Garen and Bren exchanged hopeful glances. We have a few trinkets, Garen said. Maybe we can manage something. Arya hung back, letting the travelers handle their dealings. She scanned the small cluster of huts. Some looked abandoned, shutters askew, roofs caved in. The few that were occupied appeared patched with random materials, survivors' ingenuity in a war-torn land. A scrawny goat wandered near a trough. Two teenage boys leaned against a fence, eyeing the newcomers with suspicion. After a cautious exchange of greetings, the old man waved them inside the crude boundaries of the settlement. Garen guided the cart into a small clearing between huts, and the children hopped down, looking around with wide eyes. The dog followed at a short distance, watchful but no longer bristling. Arya lingered near the cart as Myra approached. We could use more supplies, Myra said softly, but we've hardly anything to trade except some old pots and a bit of cloth. Do you think you can? Arya understood. She might be able to hunt or gather something valuable enough to barter. The recollection of her hunt the previous day stirred a sense of responsibility. I can try, she said. Give me a couple of hours. With that, she slipped away from the group, ignoring Bren's perplexed look. She weaved past the huts, stepping over broken crates and bits of debris that spoke of previous raids or battles. A gaunt woman peered at her through a doorway, cradling a young child in her arms. Arya offered a curt nod, then kept walking until she reached the edge of the settlement. From there, she headed toward a scraggly patch of trees that framed the horizon, bowing in the wind. As she moved farther from the huts, the sense of watchfulness returned, the feeling that eyes older than mortal observed her. Perhaps the old gods approved of her lending aid to those in need, or perhaps it was only the wariness that had become second nature. She found a narrow game trail and followed it cautiously. The air here was hot and still, the sun punishing. When she finally spotted a squirrel darting through the branches overhead, she tensed, considering if her dagger-throwing skill might suffice. She recalled the lessons in Bravos, how to move with stealth, how to think like a predator. But she had no bow and the distance was tricky. She tried anyway. She steadied her breath, aimed for the trunk near the squirrel's position, hoping the strike might scare it lower, or at least distract it so she could get a better shot. The dagger hissed through the air and thudded into the wood. The squirrel, startled, scampered higher, chittering indignantly. Arya cursed under her breath. She retrieved her dagger, scanning for other signs of prey. This area seemed sparse. Perhaps the village's meager existence had already driven away most game. Undeterred, she moved deeper until she heard the soft gurgle of a stream. There, she found tracks in the mud, deer by the shape of the prints. Hope stirred. If she could bring down a deer, it would feed the entire group for days and leave enough for trade. She followed the tracks, careful to keep silent, using the undergrowth for cover. The sun was well past its zenith when she finally glimpsed movement on the opposite bank. A young doe, its sleek fur golden in the dappled sunlight. It dipped its head to drink, ears flicking at the buzzing of insects. Arya's heart thumped. She had no bow, no spear, only a dagger. Taking down a deer with a single throw was nearly impossible unless the target was very close and the angle perfect. Still, necessity spurred her. She crept to the water's edge, stepping lightly on stones half buried in mud. The doe, oblivious, sipped from the stream, its muzzle sending ripples across the surface. Arya crouched behind a cluster of reeds, measuring the distance. Too far, she decided. If she tried to throw the dagger, she'd likely only wound the animal and it would bolt. Even in the best scenario, a single blade might not kill it quickly. She'd only cause suffering, and that was not her aim. As she was weighing her options, a sudden snap of a twig behind her caused her to whip around, dagger raised. A middle-aged man, face tanned from days in the sun, stood there with a crude bow in his hands. He froze as he saw Arya, and for a tense moment, neither moved. Then his eyes flicked toward the doe. "Your game," he whispered, his tone surprisingly calm. Arya, still crouched, considered him. She saw no immediate malice in his expression, only a hunter's caution. She lowered her dagger a fraction, tilting her head in acknowledgement. He nodded, then carefully fit an arrow to his bowstring. Motioning for her to remain still, he crept a few steps forward, each footfall silent on the damp earth. The doe, still unaware, bent to drink again. The man exhaled softly and loosed the arrow. It sang through the air and sank into the doe's flank. Startled, the doe bounded away with a strangled bleat, but the arrow had found its mark near a lung. Arya and the man both surged forward, crossing the stream in swift strides. The water rose to Arya's calves, chilling her feet. She glimpsed the doe staggering a short distance away, blood spattering the ferns. The man sprinted, drawing a hunting knife. Arya followed, her own blade in hand. By the time they caught up, the doe was stumbling, weakening. The man ended its suffering with a quick thrust, and the animal collapsed in a heap. For a moment, neither spoke, panting from the chase. The man tugged the arrow free and wiped the blade of his knife on the grass. Then he looked at Arya. "I saw you stalking. You have skill but no bow. A dagger wouldn't have ended well." Arya nodded, glancing at the deer. It was a decent size, enough to feed several people. "I was hunting for a village," she said quietly. "They need food." The man grimaced. "So do I. My family's half-starved." He ran a hand through his sweat-slick hair. "What if we share?" Arya studied him. "How many in your family?" "2 children, my wife. Me." She weighed the needs of the group she'd come with, nearly half a dozen travelers, including children. "I'm traveling with a group that also has children. If we split, we might both have enough. If you're willing." He let out a long breath, staring at the dead doe. Then he nodded grudgingly. "Better to share than to fight. We can't risk damaging the meat in a scuffle." He knelt and began to dress the carcass with practiced efficiency, slicing open the hide and removing innards. Arya watched, then assisted where she could, though she allowed him to take the lead. The tang of blood and offal filled the air, drawing insects. They worked quickly, the forest hush wrapping around them like a cloak. When they finished, the man bound a portion of the venison with rope, hoisting it onto his shoulder. The rest Arya packed in rough cloth she carried in her satchel. It was heavy, but manageable. If she could get it back to the village, it might be enough to barter for bread, salt, and any other supplies the refugees needed. She met the man's gaze. "Thank you," she said simply. He gave a terse nod, adjusting the weight on his shoulder. "Just hope your group doesn't try to hunt me next." "They won't," Arya assured him. "They're desperate, but they're good people." He paused, studying her face. Something in her demeanor must have convinced him of her honesty, because he nodded again. Then, without another word, he turned and vanished into the trees. Arya watched him go, a mixture of relief and lingering caution swirling in her chest. Encounters like this could end in violence so easily now. But for once, cooperation had prevailed. She followed the stream back, careful not to lose her bearings. The path was more difficult with the weight of the venison pulling at her shoulders, but she pushed on. The sun was low in the sky by the time she reached the outskirts of the village. Bren spotted her first, rushing forward with wide eyes when he saw the wrapped bundle in her arms. "Gods be good," he muttered, a grin breaking through his usually grim expression. Myra hurried over, the children trailing behind. Their eyes lit up at the prospect of fresh meat. Even Garen seemed momentarily relieved, though weariness still lined his face. Arya hoisted the bundle down. "We need to preserve it, or at least cook some of it soon," she said, exhaustion tugging at her voice. "It won't keep long in this heat." Several villagers emerged at the commotion, among them a stooped woman with a haggard face. She claimed to have some salt left, which she was willing to trade for a portion of the venison. Bren and Garen negotiated while Arya stood back, letting them handle the details. She was never one for barter and bargaining, but she watched as the travelers managed to secure salt, a small sack of oats, and even a few vegetables that someone had grown in a hidden patch of land. The children looked close to tears at the sight of so much potential food. Nightfall found them gathered around a humble fire behind one of the huts. The widow who sold goat's milk joined them, as did a few other villagers. Someone produced a battered pot, into which they placed chunks of venison, water, and a handful of vegetables. Arya sat apart, her back against the rough wooden wall of the hut, the fading light casting flickering shadows over her face. A sense of unreality draped the scene. It felt so normal, almost comforting, to share a communal meal in a place that was not wholly ravaged by war. Yet she did not forget the kill list that weighed on her mind, nor the knowledge that she was a wolf among unsuspecting sheep. One of the villagers, an older man with sparse gray hair, approached her, bowl in hand. "Here," he said softly, offering the stew. "You brought the deer after all. You're the reason we'll eat well tonight." Arya took the bowl with a slight inclination of her head. She tasted the stew, and though it was watery and undersalted, it felt like the richest meal she had eaten in weeks. The warmth spread through her, easing some of the tension in her muscles. Her mind drifted to the possibility of rest. She had walked and fought and hunted for so long, always restless, always on guard. Perhaps she could stay here one night, share a fire with these people, then move on. Just one night. The travelers, Bren, Garen, Myra, and the children, found a spot near the fire, grateful to be among at least a handful of friendly faces. Garen caught Arya's eye and raised his bowl in silent salute. She nodded back. The children ate greedily, bits of stew dribbling down their chins, though Myra tried to encourage them to go slowly. After finishing her meal, Arya left the circle of firelight, drifting into the shadowed perimeter of the huts. She stared at the star-flecked sky, inhaling the cool night air. Her mind wandered back to Winterfell, to the stories her father had told her of the kings of winter, the tales of the long night, and the vow the Night's Watch took before the old gods. A swirl of memory tugged at her, the faint outline of her father praying at the heart tree, the hush of the godswood, the swirl of leaves like crimson tears on the snow. She closed her eyes, imagining she could hear the whisper of ancient voices in the wind. The old man she had met at the settlement's entrance ambled up, leaning on his cane. The hunting dog trailed behind, sniffing warily. "You're a curious one," the old man remarked. Arya turned, studying him in the faint moonlight. "So are you," she countered, noting the sword at his hip again, an unusual accessory for a man who seemed well past his fighting prime. He gave a raspy chuckle. "War makes old men cling to weapons, I suppose. I was a soldier once, decades ago. Fought for a lord who's long dead. Now I just try to protect what little is left here." He paused, squinting at her. "Heard you traveled with that family." "Not for long, I gather." She shook her head. "Just found them on the road. They needed help, and I needed company. Plenty of that these days. People roving, searching for scraps of hope." He sighed, the lines on his face deepening. "It's a rare thing to find someone who'll share a kill rather than fight over it. You've earned my respect, girl. If you need a place to rest, I have a spare corner in my hut. Not much, but better than sleeping outside." Arya considered. The travelers' group likely had their own sleeping arrangements, but the old man's offer was unexpected kindness. She cast a glance toward the dark silhouette of the huts, then nodded. "Thank you. I'll take it." The old man tapped the ground with his cane. "Name's Terence, if you care to know." She gave a slight bow of her head. "Arya," she said, surprising herself with the honesty. But she did not offer her surname, and he did not ask for it. He led her around the huts to a small structure leaning precariously to one side. Inside, it was cramped and smelled of musty straw. The hunting dog padded in first, sniffing corners, then settled by the door. Terence gestured to a pile of old blankets in one corner. "It's not Winterfell," he said drily, "but it'll keep the bugs off." Arya's heart jolted at the mention of Winterfell, but she forced her expression to remain calm. "It'll do fine," she replied. She sank onto the blankets, exhaustion pulling at her limbs. She heard Terence settle onto a creaking cot on the other side of the room. The dog curled up at his feet, letting out a low whine. Something about the closeness, the makeshift sense of home, tugged at Arya's emotions. She thought of the times she had slept in barns, under hedges, or on the cold stone floors of half-ruined castles. This small courtesy felt like a treasure. She drifted off quickly, lulled by the day's exertions. For a time, her sleep was dreamless. Then came the familiar swirl of images. A flash of white bark, red leaves trembling in a silent wind, a direwolf's golden eyes watching her from the gloom. She felt the presence of the old gods pressing in close, as if they hovered at the edge of her mind, guiding her but never revealing the final shape of her destiny. The dream shifted, and she saw her father's face, stern and kind, mouthing words she could not hear. Then the vision cracked, flooding her with the memory of the day he was executed. The roar of the crowd, the glint of Island Payne's sword. Hatred coiled in her chest. She gasped awake, her hand clutched around the hilt of her dagger. Her breath came quick. Darkness lay over Terence's hut, though a faint silver glow seeped in through the cracks in the walls, courtesy of the moon. The old man's snores were gentle, the dog now asleep, muzzle resting on its paws. For several heartbeats, Arya willed her racing pulse to slow, forcing herself to remember that she was safe. Relatively so. She peeled her fingers from the dagger hilt, surprised at how her entire hand trembled. Sleep proved elusive after that. She lay staring at the slivers of moonlight, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. The old gods, the kill list, the memory of her father. All of it churned inside her. She wondered if she was failing him, wandering aimlessly while the realm's fate hung in the balance. If the rumors were true, if Jon had retaken Winterfell, perhaps that was where she should go. But there was still Cersei, perched in King's Landing, and Island Payne, the headsman who had taken her father's life. They remained free, unpunished. She felt the old anger rising, shaping itself into silent vows. But her father had also taught her that family came first, that the bond of blood was stronger than any vendetta. Would returning to Winterfell be an act of love or a betrayal of her vow of vengeance? Questions circled her mind until the night wore thin. Eventually, exhaustion took hold again, and she dozed fitfully. When dawn came, pale light creeping into the hut, she rose, her body aching but functional. Terence was already up, humming some tuneless melody. He offered her a cup of weak ale, which she accepted gratefully. Outside, the village stirred slowly. The travelers were packing their cart, the ox stamping the ground with impatience. Myra greeted Arya with a tired smile. "We're heading out soon," she said. "Are you coming with us?" Arya hesitated. The night's troubled thoughts weighed heavily on her. She felt the pull of two roads, one that led farther north, perhaps eventually to Winterfell, and another that might veer south or east toward King's Landing. She cleared her throat. "How far north do you plan to go?" Bren scratched his chin, glancing at the children. "Far as we can. We heard the north might be stable now. Maybe someone loyal to the Starks will take us on, let us farm or work in the holdfast. It's either that or starve down here." Arya weighed their words carefully. Traveling with them would slow her down, but it would also provide some measure of safety until she decided her next move. And there was the thought, persistent, nagging, that if Jon truly was in Winterfell, perhaps it was time she at least discovered the truth. The kill list could wait a little longer. Vengeance would always be there, an ember that never fully died, but family might slip through her grasp if she delayed too long. "All right," she said finally. "I'll stay with you a while." The children beamed, and Myra looked relieved. Garen and Bren nodded. The decision eased something in Arya's chest. A direction north. She could always break off if the kill list demanded it. But for now, she would see what awaited her in the land of her birth. They spent the morning preparing. The villagers who had shared the venison now eyed them with mild regret, likely wishing they could keep Arya's hunting skill in their midst. Still, most parted on decent terms, especially after Garen traded a few more slices of venison for a small bag of charcoal to help preserve the remainder of the meat. Terence shook Arya's hand in farewell, the calluses of his palm rough. "You've brought hope to this place, if only for a little while," he said quietly. "Safe travels, Arya." She nodded. "You too." The hunting dog trailed after them for a short distance, sniffing the wheels of the cart, before Terence whistled it back. With that, they left the Settlam, merging onto a rough path that wound its way north. The day was hot and still again, cicadas buzzing in waves of sound. The travelers walked in subdued conversation, the children lagging at times but spurred on by the promise that each step brought them closer to safety. By midday, they reached a fork in the road. One path led east, toward the Vale, and the other continued north, skirting the base of the mountains. Weather-beaten signs offered little clarity. The lettering was faded or chipped away. Garen and Bren huddled, studying the roads, while Myra tried to keep the children in the shade. Arya paced, scanning the distant slopes. The Vale was known for its precipitous passes and the gates of the moon. She had heard, in passing, that her Aunt Lisa once ruled there, but that had ended in tragedy. Or so Sansa's letters might have said long ago. Even if the Vale was stable, it was not her target. Winterfell lay beyond, in the cold heart of the north. They chose the northern route. The road was rougher, less maintained, winding through low hills dotted with scraggly pines. At times, they glimpsed the high ridges of the Mountains of the Moon, sharp and imposing against the sky. Evening approached, painting the rocky slopes in shades of amber and ochre. They found a hollow between two hills to make camp, feeding the ox on dry grass, splitting the last of the salted venison among themselves. The children ate hungrily, though Myra once again tried to ration portions, mindful that they had many days of travel ahead. Arya took her turn standing watch again that night, perched atop one of the low hills to overlook the camp. She sat beneath a solitary pine, the resin scent sharp in her nostrils. Moonlight silvered the land, revealing a world of silent contours and shifting shadows. She thought she might sense movement in the distance, perhaps a nocturnal animal or a distant traveler. She remained alert, her mind drifting to the house of black and white, to Sirio Farrell's lessons. Swift as a deer, quiet as a shadow. How different her life would have been if she had stayed in Bravos, let go of her identity completely, and become no one. But a voice deep within her had refused to surrender the name Stark, the love for her family, and the hatred for those who had taken them from her. Sometimes she questioned whether she was truly free. The old gods or destiny itself might be tugging at her strings, guiding her to each kill, each moment where she balanced the scales of justice in blood. Yet here she was, sharing a camp with people who needed her help, forging a tentative bond. That wasn't something the many-faced god would have taught her. It was human compassion, a spark she had not yet let die. Perhaps that was the real reason the old gods watched her. Not just as a killer, but as a protector of those who could not protect themselves. She remained there until her watch ended, then descended into the camp. She lay down near the ox, the animal's warmth oddly comforting, and drifted into a shallow sleep. This time, her dreams were gentler. No weirwoods or echoes of the past, just the quiet hush of a deep forest and a faint sense of something benevolent moving through the trees. The next day they pressed on. The land grew rougher, the hills steeper. The cart labored, the ox puffing hard whenever the path inclined. Garen and Bren took turns pushing at the wheels to help the beast manage. The children trotted alongside, occasionally whining about sore feet. Myra gently urged them on, promising rest at the next flat stretch of road. Arya scouted ahead, scanning for any sign of danger. In the late afternoon, they spotted a thin spiral of smoke curling from a distant ridge. Suspicion gnawed at Arya. Smoke meant people, maybe travelers or bandits or even the scattered remnants of some Lord soldiers. She decided to investigate, telling Garen and Bren to wait at a safe distance. If it turned out to be trouble, she would slip away unnoticed. Climbing the ridge proved arduous, the loose stones shifting beneath her boots. She moved as quietly as possible, half expecting to find a hidden encampment. Instead, she came upon the ruin of a small tower perched on the crest. Its stones tumbled in a ring of rubble. Nearby stood a makeshift fire pit with smoldering ashes. A single figure sat on a chunk of fallen masonry, stirring the embers with a stick. Arya froze, scanning for others, but saw no sign of a companion. The figure wore a dusty cloak, hood pulled up, obscuring the face. She crouched behind a rock, carefully shifting her angle to see if there was any sign of a weapon. A sword leaned against the broken wall, within easy reach. The hilt glinted in the failing light, suggesting decent craftsmanship. Finally, Arya decided that she needed more information. If the stranger posed a threat, she would handle it. If not, perhaps they might barter or at least offer directions. She rose from her hiding spot, hand near her dagger. "Hello," she called. The cloaked figure started, dropping the stick into the embers. A gloved hand went for the sword but didn't draw it immediately. A woman's voice, terse but not unfriendly, answered, "Who goes there?" "A traveler," Arya said, stepping closer with slow caution. The woman's posture was tense, coiled like a spring. Arya saw a glimpse of her face beneath the hood. A scar ran from her temple to her jaw, half hidden by unkempt hair. "I'm not looking for a fight." The woman let out a short bark of laughter. "Everyone says that until they are." She eyed Arya, taking in her slight frame, the practical clothing, the dagger at her waist. "You're alone." Arya considered lying, then opted for partial truth. "I'm with a small group, families, children. We saw your fire from the road." The woman eased off slightly, though her hand remained near the sword's hilt. "There's not much here," she said, gesturing at the crumbling tower. "Just a place to keep out of sight." "Are you hiding?" Arya asked, edging closer, though she kept to a careful angle in case the woman lashed out. The woman snorted. "Aren't we all, these days?" She shifted her cloak, revealing a threadbare tunic beneath. Her boots were scuffed, layered with dust. The scars on her face suggested either a soldier's history or a victim of violence. I deserted my lord's service months ago when everything fell apart. Now I find quiet corners to survive. Arya knew better than to press for details. Deserting, especially if her lord was powerful, could mean a death sentence. We're heading north, maybe to the Vale, maybe farther. She paused. No intention of harming you. We just wanted to be sure you weren't going to ambush us. A bitter smile curved the woman's lips. If I wanted to rob you, I'd find someone richer than children and ragged refugees. She nudged the stick in the embers again. There's not much to be gained in these hills, except safety from the roads. You do what you must to get by. Arya nodded. That's what we're doing. We'll move on. The woman studied her for a moment. You don't have the look of a common refugee, though. Not with that stance. She tilted her head. You can fight, can't you? Arya allowed a tight smile. If I have to. Thought so. The woman's voice held a note of admiration. Look, if you're heading north, you'll want to watch out. There have been rumors of men in black robes roaming about, harassing travelers. Some say they're fanatics from the Riverlands. Others say they might be remnants of the faith militant. Hard to know, but they're dangerous, from what I hear. A flicker of disquiet moved through Arya. She remembered the zealots of the faith militant who had risen in King's Landing under the High Sparrow, though she had never encountered them directly. War did strange things to people, and fanatics often found new corners in which to thrive. Thanks for the warning, she said. The woman shrugged. Let them keep to themselves. I just want to be left alone. She kicked at a stray stone, sending it tumbling down the ridge. If your group wants shelter for the night, you can take the eastern side of the tower. Some of the walls still stand. It might keep the wind off you. I'll move on. No need to move, Arya said, surprising herself with a flicker of generosity. We won't trouble you if you won't trouble us. The woman eyed her, then shrugged. Suit yourself. Just don't get too close. Arya nodded. She backed away, never fully turning her back on the stranger, then descended the ridge to where the others waited. Garen's expression was drawn with worry. Well, it's just a deserter traveling alone, Arya said. She won't bother us if we don't bother her. There's an old tower up there where we might find some shelter. Myra's eyes flicked toward the ridge, uncertain. Can we trust her? Arya paused. I think so for now. If she wanted to attack us, she's had the chance. Bren and Garen exchanged looks. We'll keep watch anyway, Bren said, his hand unconsciously tightening on a walking stick he'd been using. I'm too old to fight, but I can shout an alarm if need be. They guided the ox and cart up the ridge, the wheels scraping against the stones. Once at the top, the group found a space on the eastern side of the collapsed tower, where a partial wall provided a windbreak. The deserter woman kept her distance, perched on her chunk of masonry on the western side, occasionally glancing at them but making no move to interfere. Under the dimming sky, Arya helped gather what meager firewood they could find among the rubble and scraggly shrubs. They lit a small fire, enough to heat water for the oats they had traded from the village. It was a thin porridge, but at least it filled the belly. The children huddled close, grateful for the relative shelter from the wind. Arya noticed the deserter glancing their way from time to time, as if wistful for the company or perhaps envious of the warmth. She caught Arya's eye but looked away quickly. Arya wondered about her story. What cruelty or betrayal had driven her to desert, leaving her to survive alone in these hills? There were 1,000 stories like hers across Westeros now. Every ruined keep, every mass grave, every sobbing child pointed to the magnitude of the war's devastation. Night fell, clear and starlit, the air turning crisp. Arya took the first watch again, a pattern that now felt familiar. She walked the perimeter of the broken tower, scanning the rolling hills below. The moonlight was bright enough to reveal a desolate landscape of stone and sparse brush, but no movement caught her eye. Garen and Bren dozed near the fire, while Myra held her children close, murmuring a lullaby. The deserter woman sat alone with her back to a fragment of wall, hugging her knees. Now and then, she traced a finger along the scar on her cheek, lost in thought. At some point, Arya circled back to her vantage point near the southwestern corner. The partial wall looked out over a steep drop of jagged rock. She was about to move on when she heard a faint sound, footsteps scraping on stone. She tensed, peering into the gloom. A figure scrambled up the slope from below, too far for her to make out details but close enough that she heard the labored breathing. Heart pounding, Arya slipped behind a piece of rubble, trying to catch a better view without giving herself away. The figure drew closer. Moonlight illuminated a man in dark, rough-spun robes, a rope belt around his waist, and a cudgel in hand. Behind him, 2 more men followed, similarly dressed, each holding a crude weapon. Their faces were partially concealed by hoods, but she glimpsed harsh lines, unkempt beards. Fanatics? The deserter's warning rang in her mind. She swallowed, mind racing. If these were the men in black robes who had been terrorizing travelers, they were mere feet from the sleeping families. She flattened herself against the stone, debating what to do. The men advanced, their eyes fixed on the faint glow of Arya's group's campfire. She heard a low hiss of speech. "There they are," one muttered. "We'll teach them to pollute the land with their sins." Arya felt a surge of anger. Were these zealots coming to murder children in the name of some twisted faith? She reached for her dagger, adrenaline spiking. She was outnumbered, but these men likely had no real training. Swift, precise strikes might turn the tide before they could rally. She crept around, trying to get closer without being seen. As the robed men approached the camp, the deserter woman rose abruptly, sword in hand. "Stop!" she barked. "State your business." The men froze, startled for a moment, then snarled. "We are the Unbroken Brothers," said the leader in a hoarse voice. "We cleanse the land of the wicked and faithless. Surrender yourselves, and your judgment shall be swift." A harsh laugh escaped the deserter's lips. "Judgment? What nonsense is this?" Before the zealots could answer, Arya stepped out from the shadows behind them, her dagger angled to strike. "You should leave," she said coldly. "There are children here, innocent families. They're no threat to you." The leader whirled, brandishing his cudgel. His eyes gleamed with fanatical light. "Innocent? All sinners are equal before the 7. He lunged at Arya without warning, swinging the cudgel in a brutal arc. She dodged, the wind of his strike brushing her cheek. The second man lunged at the deserter, who parried with a clang of steel. Sparks flew in the moonlight. Pandemonium erupted. Garen woke with a startled cry, stumbling to his feet, while Bren grabbed for his walking stick. Myra gasped, pulling the children behind a section of fallen wall. The third zealot rushed in, wielding a long knife. Arya feinted left, then pivoted right, slashing at his arm. The blade bit flesh and he howled. Blood spattered the stones. The leader snarled, swinging again. Arya ducked low, aiming for his knees. He twisted, absorbing the slash on his thick robe. He brought the cudgel down at her shoulder, but she darted back, hearing the air crack as would met rock. She struck again, faster than his eye could track, cutting him across the wrist. He cursed, dropping the cudgel with a dull thud. Meanwhile, the deserter woman clashed with the second zealot, swords ringing in the night. He thrust, she parried, deflecting his strike. With a grunt, she slammed her hilt into his face. He staggered, nose pouring blood. She capitalized, driving her blade into his chest. He collapsed, choking on his own breath. Arya ducked as the wounded third zealot lunged again, ignoring his arm wound. She spun, hooking his ankle with her foot, sending him crashing to the ground. Before he could rise, she pressed her dagger to his throat, eyes cold. "Yield," she commanded. He spat at her, hate twisting his features. "Never." She pushed the blade in, severing his final breath. Her heart hammered, adrenaline coursing through every limb. This was an old dance, a deadly one she knew too well. The leader, clutching his bleeding wrist, stumbled toward the broken tower wall, eyes wild. The deserter leveled her sword at him. "Don't," she warned. "Stay where you are." But the man only sneered. "You're all damned." he hissed. He spun, trying to vault over the rubble, perhaps to flee. His wounded wrist betrayed him. He slipped, lost balance, and tumbled over the edge with a shriek that ended abruptly on the rocks below. A hush fell, broken only by the labored breathing of Arya and the deserter woman. Garen gaped, holding Myra's arm as she clutched the children. Bren leaned on his walking stick, eyes wide with shock. The night smelled of blood and fear, thick in the air. Slowly, Arya stood, wiping her blade on the zealot's robe. Her mind spun. She had killed again, swiftly, instinctively. The old god's presence flared at the edge of her consciousness, that dark hum of approval. She felt neither pride nor regret, only the numb certainty that it had to be done. The deserter wiped her sword on her cloak, gaze sweeping the carnage. She met Arya's eyes. In the moonlight there was understanding, an unspoken recognition of shared violence. Then she sheathed her sword and turned away, muttering something about it being safer to depart before dawn. Garen gently guided the children away, telling them not to look at the bodies. Bren stood rooted, face ashen. Myra trembled, tears in her eyes, but she stroked the children's hair, whispering that it was over. Arya stepped closer to her. "They're safe now," she murmured. "We'll leave as soon as it's light." Myra nodded, swallowing. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. For the rest of the night, no one slept well. The deserter woman vanished before dawn, leaving only a half-dead fire behind. Arya found it difficult to fault her for leaving. Bloodshed clung to this place now, a memory that would haunt the old stones. When the first faint glow of morning touched the sky, the group packed their meager belongings and set off once again, hearts heavier than before. The path wound deeper into rugged terrain, and the days bled together. Arya guided them with a quiet determination, scouting ahead whenever possible, ensuring no more zealots or bandits caught them unawares. The children ceased their whining, as if the terror of that night had silenced their complaints. Myra's eyes bore a haunted look, but she continued on, driven by maternal love. Garen and Bren hardly spoke, focusing all their energy on guiding the cart. When they could, they bartered with small mountain villages that clung to the stony slopes, exchanging morsels of venison or scraps of cloth for dried beans, coarse bread, or a place to shelter. Some villages were empty, ghost towns hollowed by war and the savage winter that had struck the region. Others had survivors who eyed strangers with suspicion, but occasionally offered grudging assistance in exchange for chores or coin. Through it all, Arya remained vigilant, sleeping lightly, reciting the kill list in her head. Each name came to her like an incantation, a reminder of who she was and what she fought for. The old gods sometimes whispered in her dreams, though the messages remained elusive. Images of ravens circling a weirwood, the swirl of red leaves, a wolf's outline shimmering in a moonlit forest. She woke each time feeling the faint burn of purpose in her veins. At last, they crested a ridge one morning and looked down upon a broader valley sloping away to the north. The air felt cooler here, the wind carrying a hint of alpine scent. Arya could see the distant shimmer of a river weaving through the valley floor. Beyond that, the outlines of hills that might eventually lead to the neck, the marshy region dividing the north from the south. Her heart quickened. If they pressed on, they would eventually reach the lands of her birth. Bren shielded his eyes with a hand, gazing across the expanse. "Never thought I'd see the north in my lifetime," he murmured. "Heard it's cold and harsh, but maybe they're kinder to travelers there." Myra's face was pale with exhaustion, but she managed a hopeful look. "The children will be safe, I pray." Arya remained silent. She wasn't certain what awaited them, or her, once they crossed into the north. If Jon indeed held Winterfell, there might be a measure of safety. But the realm had changed so much, and her place in it was uncertain. She only knew she had to keep moving forward, guided by an invisible hand older and more powerful than men's wars. They descended the ridge. The road here was marginally better, wide enough for a cart without constant fear of tipping. They made decent progress, passing through scattered pine groves, the resin scent thick in the warming air. After so many days of hard travel, A sense of guarded optimism seeped into the group. Perhaps they would survive after all, find a new life on northern soil. That night, they made camp near a copse of alder trees by a swift-running stream. Garen coaxed the ox to drink, while Myra and the children gathered sticks to start a small fire. Bren massaged his weary legs, muttering about the days when he was spry enough to march all day without complaint. Arya scouted a short distance upstream, washing her face and hands, letting the cold water shock her senses. As she stood, droplets clinging to her skin, she sensed movement at her periphery. A large shape flickered between the trees. Her pulse leapt. Could it be a bear or a wolf pack? The shape lingered, then vanished. She kept her dagger ready, inching toward the spot. A rustle of leaves, a flash of fur. Her breath caught. A dire wolf? It was huge, though partially obscured. She glimpsed the faint glimmer of gold eyes. "Nymeria," she whispered, the name slipping from her lips before she could stop it. The shape withdrew, silent and swift, dissolving into the twilight gloom. Heart hammering, Arya pushed through the undergrowth, but the creature was gone. Had it been Nymeria, her long-lost companion, or just another wolf grown large in the harsh wilderness? She felt an ache in her chest, a longing that brought tears to her eyes. She turned back toward camp, shoulders trembling. She couldn't be certain. Dire wolves were rare, especially this far south, but not unheard of. Nymeria would be older, leading a pack by now, if the rumors were true. The glimpse haunted Arya, stirring memories of a time when she was simply a child with a beloved wolf by her side. So much had changed since then. She returned to the small campsite, her face composed but her emotions roiling beneath the surface. The children noticed something in her expression, for they gave her a wide berth, as if sensing she needed space. Garen offered her a questioning glance, but she only shook her head. That night, she slept fitfully, half dreaming of Nymeria's golden eyes shining through the dark, guiding her northward like twin beacons. Morning brought a crispness to the air, a whisper of the north's breath. They trudged onward, the path winding through rolling hills. The conversation was subdued, each step a chore for the weary travelers. Arya felt a strange anticipation, as if each mile brought her closer to answering the question that had haunted her since she fled King's Landing so many years ago. Where did she truly belong? At midday, they reached a rustic inn perched near a crossroads, a weathered sign depicting a faded fox. Smoke curled from its chimney, and the aroma of stew drifted through the open door. A handful of horses were tied at a rail outside, suggesting travelers within. Garen and Bren exchanged hopeful glances. A proper meal and perhaps a real bed for the children sounded like heaven. But caution tinged their excitement. Inns could be dens of brigands or unscrupulous men looking to profit from the desperate. Still, they had come too far not to try. They guided the ox to the side of the building, tethering it near a trough. Myra and the children waited outside while Arya, Garen, and Bren entered. The inn's common room was dim, tables scattered about with a few patrons hunched over cups of ale. A plump woman behind the bar turned suspicious eyes on the newcomers, wiping her hands on a stained apron. "Travelers?" she asked in a brusque tone. Garen nodded. "Aye, we've come a long way. Looking for a meal, maybe a room for the children if your prices are fair." She sniffed. "How many children?" "Two," Garen said. "And their mother." The woman eyed them, probably assessing how much coin they could muster. "Rooms aren't cheap. Wars made supplies dear. If you've coin, I won't turn you away. But no trouble, mind." Bren fumbled with the pouch at his belt, offering a meager handful of coppers. The woman scoffed. "You'll need more than that for a room. A bowl of stew and a bit of bread, maybe." Arya, silent until now, stepped forward. "We have some salt venison left, well preserved. Trade you that for a room for the night, for the mother and her children." The woman's eyes narrowed. "Venison, you say? Let me see." Arya nodded at Garen, who retrieved a small bundle from the cart outside. He brought it in, unwrapping a few choice cuts of dried, salted venison. The woman's expression shifted from suspicion to interest. "That's a decent bit of meat," she mused. "All right, A room for the mother and her brats, and some stew for the rest of you. You'll sleep in the common area by the fire, mind you. Deal, Arya said, stepping back to let Garen handle the details. She scanned the room while they concluded their barter. A pair of travelers sat at a table in one corner, whispering to each other. Their clothing looked dusty, but they bore no obvious weapons aside from a belt knife. Another man in the far corner drank alone, face hidden beneath a hood. Arya felt his gaze on her, an uneasy prickling on her skin. She pretended not to notice, but she positioned herself so she could keep him in sight. At length, Myra and the children were shown upstairs to a small, cramped room. Garen and Bren remained below, sipping the thin stew the innkeep provided. Arya accepted a bowl as well. It tasted mostly of onions and weak broth, but it was hot, and after so many days on the road, hot food was a blessing. She found a place near the fireplace, spooning the stew slowly, forcing her tight shoulders to relax. The hooded man in the corner rose, dropping a few coins on the table. He walked past her, heading for the door. As he passed, he cast her a sidelong look. She glimpsed a shadowed face beneath, scarred or pocked in places. She tensed, ready for an attack, but he simply walked out into the daylight, the door swinging shut behind him. The silence in the common room felt heavier, as if a small storm had passed overhead without unleashing its fury. Garen and Bren seemed oblivious, too consumed with their meal and exhaustion to notice. Later, as dusk settled, the few patrons in the inn went to their rooms or drifted out the door to continue their journeys. The innkeep, sour-faced but businesslike, gestured for Arya, Garen, and Bren to lay out their blankets near the hearth. "Mind your gear," she said curtly. "I'm not responsible if some sneak thief comes in." Garen snorted. "Not much left to steal," he muttered. Arya settled against the wall, her pack and dagger close at hand. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the worn timbers. Bren grunted as he shifted his old bones, while Garen stared at the flames, lost in thought. Arya's eyes grew heavy, lulled by the unaccustomed comfort of a roof overhead. She slept, drifting through a half-remembered dream of Winterfell's courtyard, the sound of swords clashing as she trained with Jon. Then the courtyard filled with snow, and the direwolf from her earlier vision appeared, its eyes shining in the pale whiteness, beckoning her northward. She tried to speak to it, but no words came. Instead, the wolf turned and bounded away, leaving only paw prints in the snow that glowed with a faint, red light, reminiscent of weirwood leaves. She followed, heart pounding, unsure whether she was chasing the wolf or it was leading her. A sudden clang woke her. She bolted upright, dagger in hand, scanning the dimly lit common room. The fire had burned low, embers casting a dull glow. Garen and Bren stirred, blinking blearily. The innkeep's voice came from near the door, raised in anger. Arya scrambled to her feet, the dagger's blade catching the faint light. "What's the meaning of this?" the innkeep demanded, her voice a shrill hiss. A shadowy figure stood by the entrance, someone wearing dark clothes, half turned away from Arya's view. Another clang sounded, perhaps a dropped mug or pot. "Apologies," the figure said. The voice was low, gravelly. "I meant no harm, just looking for a friend." Arya eased closer, heart pounding. Could it be the hooded man from earlier or someone else? She stepped into a patch of moonlight filtering through a small window, letting her eyes adjust. The figure turned. She glimpsed a face etched with worry, the faint sheen of sweat on a brow partially hidden by thick, dark hair. Their eyes met, and Arya froze. Recognition jolted through her like lightning. Gendry, the same boy who had traveled with her once, who had been taken by the Brotherhood without banners, who had shaped her memory of fleeting camaraderie. She had assumed she might never see him again. A swirl of emotions crashed over her. Disbelief, relief, caution, and something warmer she couldn't name. He stared back, eyes widening in equal shock. "Arya?" he breathed, stepping forward, ignoring the innkeep's furious glare. Could it be you?" She swallowed, nodding dumbly, her grip on her dagger loosening. Gendry, she managed, her voice catching. A stunned silence filled the room. Garen and Bren looked between them, puzzled, while the innkeep folded her arms, annoyed by the intrusion. Arya felt as though the ground had shifted beneath her feet. So many years had passed. He looked older, broader in the shoulders, the lines of his face sharper. But the glint in his eyes, that earnestness tempered by hardship, was unmistakable. For a moment, neither spoke, too many questions warring for space. Then Gendry let out a ragged breath. 7 hells? He murmured, running a hand over his face. I thought you were gods. The rumors said so many things. I never believed you'd actually be alive and here, of all places. Arya's throat felt tight. Memories washed over her. The times they had traveled together with Hot Pie, the captivity at Harrenhal, the Brotherhood. She remembered Gendry's mixture of kindness and bluntness. I'm alive, she said, her voice calmer than she felt. What about you? Are you still with them? Thuras and the rest? Gendry shook his head. No, I left them. Didn't like the direction it was going after Beric died again. Thuras was lost in drink, and Lady Stoneheart. He grimaced, trailing off. It got dark. I left to find my own way. Been forging armor here and there, traveling, looking for honest work. Arya nodded slowly. Same as me, I suppose. She noticed Garen stepping forward. Curiosity etched into his tired features. You know him? He asked Arya, still clutching his walking stick. She glanced at him. Yes, from years ago. We traveled together. It felt so inadequate to sum up their shared history in those words, but she let it stand. Gendry exhaled, glancing at the children huddled near the stairs, Myra having come down at the commotion. You've got quite a group with you, he noted. She snorted softly. Not mine. They're refugees trying to reach the north. I'm helping them. The innkeep, evidently deciding there was no threat, stomped over to her small bar, muttering about being woken in the middle of the night. She lit a candle, illuminating the scene with a flickering glow. Gendry looked Arya up and down, likely noticing the scars and the hardened lines that had not been there before. A flicker of pain crossed his face, as if he recognized how much both of them had lost. Arya struggled for words, wanting to ask 1,000 questions. How he had survived, where he had been, if he knew anything of her family. But the room felt too crowded, the moment too raw. Instead, she asked quietly, Will you join us? We're heading north. You could come. He stared at her, emotions warring in his gaze. Then he nodded. He said, and the softness in his voice reminded her of the boy she had once known. I'll come. If you'll have me. She nodded, relief and uncertainty tangling in her chest. We can talk in the morning, she said. She barely resisted the urge to reach out and grip his hand, to feel the tangible proof that he was real. The innkeep, seeing that the matter was settled, jerked her head. You can stay in the common room with the others, she said. But no more racket. Gendry gave a sheepish nod. Arya guided him toward the hearth, where Garen and Bren scooted aside to make room. She introduced them briefly, explaining only that she and Gendry were old friends from the road. The men, exhausted, accepted this with mild curiosity, then settled back to sleep. Gendry and Arya remained seated on the floor, the fire's last embers glowing between them. They spoke in hushed tones so as not to wake the others. Gendry recounted how he had grown uneasy with the Brotherhood's increasingly ruthless actions, especially under Lady Stoneheart, a vengeful figure who, in his words, seemed more a specter of death than a champion of the people. He had escaped in the dead of night, forging what equipment he could for himself. Since then, he had moved from settlement to settlement, smithing when possible, hunting when coin was scarce. Arya listened, her heart heavy at the mention of Lady Stoneheart. She had heard rumors of a vengeful spirit leading the Brotherhood, rumored to be Catelyn Stark's resurrected corpse. But she couldn't bring herself to delve deeper. The mere thought that her mother's body might walk in hatred was a wound too deep to examine. In turn, Arya offered scraps of her own story, arriving back in Westeros after Braavos, traveling alone, guided by a kill list and a restless need for vengeance. She did not mention the deeper truth of the old god's pull, or the dreams that haunted her, but Gendry sensed the darkness that lay under her words. He gave her a searching look, as if trying to reconcile the girl he had known with the hardened assassin before him. Eventually, the fatigue proved overwhelming. They arranged themselves around the dying fire, Gendry on one side, Arya on the other. Though they slept separately, the knowledge of the other's presence was a comfort neither had expected to find. Night passed in relative peace, with only the flicker of candlelight from the innkeep station to interrupt the darkness. Dawn arrived, cool and gray, washing over the worn timbers of the inn. The travelers rose stiffly, gathering their belongings. Myra and the children ate a simple breakfast of oatcakes provided by the innkeep, courtesy of the venison trade. Garen offered to help with the cart, double-checking the ox's harness. Bren rubbed his sore back, grumbling about the hardness of the floor. Through it all, Arya felt Gendry's presence at her side like a strange dream. She caught him glancing at her occasionally, curiosity mingled with relief. When they were ready, they paid the innkeep in the remainder of the dried venison, plus a few coppers, and stepped outside. The morning sky threatened rain, low clouds drifting across the hills. Gendry had a small pack slung over his shoulder, along with a hammer strapped to his belt. His blacksmith's hammer, a relic of the craft he had been born to. Arya remembered watching him forge swords once, sweat glistening on his muscled arms. Felt like a lifetime ago. They set off along the northern road. The group expanded by one more soul. The children eyed Gendry curiously, especially the older boy, who seemed fascinated by the hammer. Gendry offered a friendly grin, adjusting the strap of his pack. "Might find a smithy up north," he said, mostly to Arya. "Lord Stark, if that's who's in charge, could probably use a blacksmith if they're rebuilding Winterfell." She nodded, swallowing. "If Jon is there, yes, but I'm not certain. We've only heard rumors." He frowned. "Jon Snow, you mean? Didn't think he was a Stark, exactly." She bristled, then forced herself to relax. "He's more Stark than some I've met," she said simply. Gendry caught the edge in her tone and nodded, letting the matter drop. Their footsteps rustled the damp grass. The children laughed as Gendry told a quick story about forging a horseshoe so poorly that the horse threw it off within a day. A fleeting moment of levity in a journey that had seen too little. Arya watched them from the corner of her eye, feeling an odd warmth that came with having an old friend near, especially one who did not recoil from her scars, visible or otherwise. For hours they traveled without incident, the road winding northward, the hills gradually flattening. A light drizzle began to fall, speckling the dirt with dark spots. Arya noted that the temperature dropped slightly as they progressed, a sure sign they were nearing the threshold of the north. Whether that gave her comfort or dread, she couldn't say. As dusk approached, they came upon an abandoned watchtower near a bend in the road, overgrown with ivy. The roof had partially collapsed, but the lower level offered some shelter from the drizzle. Garen led the ox there, and the group made camp for the night. Gendry used his hammer to pry away rotted timbers that threatened to fall, while Bren gathered brush to start a small fire. Myra and Arya scouted the area for any sign of game, returning with a single skinny rabbit that would scarcely feed them all. Still, they combined it with oats and water, creating a thin stew. That evening, Arya and Gendry found a quiet corner of the watchtower to talk. The children slept near the fire, with Garen and Bren standing watch. Rain dripped through cracks in the stone ceiling, forming puddles on the uneven floor. A damp chill clung to the air. "So," Gendry said softly, leaning against a crumbling wall, "tell me about Bravos. How did you end up there? And how did you come back?" Arya exhaled, running a hand through her short hair. She offered a condensed version. Escaping Westeros using the coin Jaqen Hagar had given her, training in the House of Black and White, learning to serve the many-faced god. She mentioned the rigors of the training, the brutal lessons, the time she had lost her sight. Gendry listened, eyes somber, occasionally asking a quiet question. He He shook his head when she finished. "You've been through more than anyone should," he said. "I'm sorry." She shrugged, the old reflex. "We all have, but it made me who I am." Gendry considered her. "And who are you now, Arya?" "Truly." She opened her mouth, then shut it. The question rang in her mind, echoing the doubts she'd harbored for so long. She was Arya Stark, but also the girl who trained with the faceless men, the girl who slew without hesitation, the girl whose dreams were haunted by wolves and heart trees. "I'm still trying to figure that out," she admitted, almost too quietly. "But I know I'm not no one. I tried that. It didn't take." A small smile tugged at Gendry's lips. "I'm glad you're still you," he said. "I missed you." She stared at him, emotions tangling in her chest. She wanted to say she missed him too, missed their camaraderie, the sense that they were survivors together. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with pride and lingering scars. Instead, she nodded, letting the moment rest on a shared, unspoken understanding. Rain drummed on the crumbling stones overhead, a lullaby of the storm. They eventually parted, each finding a spot to curl up for sleep. Arya's rest was restless, filled with half-formed dreams of the House of Black and White merging with images of Winterfell's courtyard, as if her past and her future warred in her mind. Once, she jolted awake, half certain she felt the presence of her father's ghost. But it was only Gendry shifting in his sleep, his silhouette cast by the faint glow of the dying fire. The next few days blurred into one long march northward, the drizzle turning to bouts of heavier rain. The road grew muddier, slowing he cart. Tempers flared at times, especially when the children whined from cold and hunger. Still, they pressed on, driven by hope of a better life in the land of the Starks. Each mile they traveled, Arya felt the old gods' call intensify, as if the ancient forests and weirwoods recognized her approach, beckoning her forward. At night, she caught glimpses of the wolf in her dreams, always at the edge of her vision, leading her deeper into the heart of the north. Gendry stayed close, sharing what little warmth and humor he could. He told the children stories of traveling smiths, forging horseshoes for knights and farmers alike. He helped Garen make minor repairs to the cart's wheel. During these moments, Arya felt an odd pang, like a hint of longing for something simpler, a life untouched by vengeance. But the list remained in her mind, ever present, a chain of promises waiting to be fulfilled. At last, they reached a place where the land flattened and the sky felt vaster. The air carried a biting chill now, a promise of the north's unforgiving climate. The fields around them showed signs of new growth, pale green shoots braving the cold. Beyond, the shape of a grand forest loomed, a labyrinth of pines and ancient oaks that stretched across the horizon. Garen gazed at it as though it were a holy sight. "They call that the outskirts of the Wolfswood, don't they?" he asked, turning to Arya. She nodded, remembering the Wolfswood from her childhood. If her sense of direction was correct, that forest was only a few days' journey from Winterfell. A swirl of anxiety and anticipation coiled in her gut. She glanced at Gendry, who offered a small, supportive nod, and at Myra, whose eyes brimmed with hope that they were nearly there. Bren's posture straightened, as if he found renewed vigor. The children squealed, pointing at a small herd of deer grazing in the distance. Arya felt a pang at the memory of her hunts, but she pushed it aside. They would reach the forest soon enough, plenty of game there. For the moment, the group pressed on. That night, they found a sheltered spot in a shallow ravine, starting a fire that crackled in the crisp air. The sky was clear, stars wheeling overhead in a breathtaking tapestry. Arya sat next to Gendry, the warmth of the fire against her face, the cold breeze at her back. She realized with a start that her shoulder, wounded in that distant burning settlement, no longer ached. Time and the old gods had mended it, leaving only a thin scar as testimony. Tomorrow, she told herself, or the day after, they would reach Winterfell's environs. She did not know what she would find there, Jon, Sansa, perhaps even Bran. Would they recognize her? Would they fear the killer she had become? The old gods had marked her for a purpose, But would that purpose align with the needs of her family? Questions circled like crows, offering no answers. She stared into the flames, letting them dance in her vision until they blurred. Somewhere behind her eyes, the wolf from her dreams prowled, and the names from her kill list stirred like restless spirits. But for this moment, she was surrounded by tired, determined souls who had pinned their hopes on the North, on House Stark, on the possibility of a new beginning. And she, Arya Stark, marked by the old gods, would guide them the rest of the way, her blade ever ready, her heart braced for whatever final reckoning awaited her beneath the weirwood's silent gaze. They doused the fire to embers, slipping into uneasy sleep. The forest loomed on the horizon, a promise, a warning, a home. And as the night sky stretched endlessly above them, Arya felt a resonance in her bones, the hum of ancient power whispering that her story was far from over, that in the dark and tangled paths ahead, she would find both the ghosts of her past and the shape of her destiny. All she had to do was keep walking, guided by vengeance and compassion, by the memory of a wolf's golden eyes and a father's gentle words, until she stood at last beneath the heart tree in Winterfell's Godswood, face to face with her fate, whatever it might be.